On the evening of November 16, 1936, a king came to dinner with his mother and told her he intended to marry a woman she had refused to meet. He sat across the table from her at Marlborough House, this man who had been the most photographed person on earth for 15 years, the golden prince the empire had adored since the end of the war, and he told her, clearly and without apology, that he would not be king without Wallis Simpson beside him. He would abdicate if he had to. He would walk away from the throne, the crown, the burden and the privilege his family had built across generations. Queen Mary listened. Her face, according to the accounts of those who knew her well, did not collapse into tears. Her voice did not rise. She sat with the posture she had maintained since girlhood, straight and controlled and arranged. And when he finished, she told him that if he proceeded with this marriage, he would have to leave the country. Those were the only two options she saw: marry the woman and go, or give the woman up and stay. He would not give her up. She would not accept the marriage. That dinner ended the conversation between them, though neither knew it at the time. They would meet again, in harder rooms and under worse circumstances, but the easy fellowship that had once existed between a mother and her favorite son was effectively done in that dining room in November, over a meal that neither one of them could have eaten with any comfort. This is the story of why. It is a story about two women who never properly met, conducted across more than a decade, fought in letters and through social exclusions, and through the withholding of a single set of initials. It is a story about a queen who had spent 60 years learning that personal feeling must be subordinate to duty, and who discovered in the last chapter of her life that she could not make the two coexist when the personal feeling in question was grief so absolute it could not be named in any document she would allow to survive her. Queen Mary outlived the abdication by 17 years. She died in March 1953, at the age of 85, 3 months before her granddaughter was crowned. In those 17 years, she never once received the Duchess of Windsor. She never acknowledged Wallis in any formal capacity. She referred to her, on the rare occasions she referred to her at all, as that woman, and she said it with a flatness that contemporaries found more unsettling than any amount of visible anger would have been. Henry Channon, the politician and diarist who moved in the highest social circles of the era, wrote in 1936 that Queen Mary and the court group hate Wallis Simpson to the point of hysteria. He was not entirely wrong about the hatred. He was wrong about the hysteria. Queen Mary was not a woman who did hysteria. What she did was something colder and more lasting. She organized her contempt, filed it neatly, and let it operate without public announcement for the rest of her life. To understand why that contempt ran so deep, you have to understand the woman who carried it. And to understand Queen Mary, you have to go back to a girl in borrowed rooms. She was born on May 26, 1867, at Kensington Palace, which sounds grand until you understand the particular quality of grandeur available to her family. The address was royal. The accounts were not. Princess Victoria Mary Augusta Louise Olga, Paulina Claudine, Agnes of Teck, came into the world in a suite of apartments at a palace that housed multiple households, some of them considerably more comfortable than her own, and was known from the beginning as May, which sounded simple and sweet and almost modest. There was nothing simple about the situation she was born into. Her mother was Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, granddaughter of George III and first cousin of Queen Victoria, warm and sociable and catastrophically disorganized about money. Her father was Francis, Duke of Teck, a German prince, with a title that sounded grander than his fortune. He had looks and charm, and a rank that required expensive maintenance. What he did not have was enough income to sustain the life the title implied. May was the eldest child and only daughter. She had 3 younger brothers. She absorbed everything. The Teck household moved between Kensington Palace and White Lodge in Richmond Park, and what May learned in those rooms was a lesson most children in her position would not have recognized as a lesson at all. She learned the difference between rank and security. She saw that a person could live in royal apartments and still owe bills. She saw that a duchess could curtsy to and be curtsied to, could have her mother photographed at court events, could be addressed by titles that carried the full weight of history, and still know that the carpet underfoot was not entirely paid for. Some children who grow up this way become anxious and pleading, constantly working to charm the room into approving of them. May became watchful instead. She noticed who stood where. She noticed who bowed and who did not. She noticed which invitations mattered, and which were received with a politeness that concealed a private assessment. She kept her observations to herself, which gave her time to accumulate them. The family's financial troubles worsened in the early 1880s until what polite society called living more cheaply abroad became unavoidable. The Tex left Britain in 1883 and spent time on the continent, staying with relatives, eventually settling for a period in Florence. For a girl who had been watching, Florence was an education of a particular kind. She walked through galleries and churches and saw what dynasties looked like when they had lasted. She saw how objects carried meaning, how a family that controlled beautiful things looked like a family that intended to endure. She came home from exile understanding something that her mother, for all her warmth, had never quite grasped, that the visible evidence of permanence is itself a form of power. By the time the Tex returned to England in 1885, May had become exactly the kind of princess that the monarchy could use. Queen Victoria, who liked to categorize the people around her with the efficiency of a woman who had been doing it for 50 years, approved of May. She was British-born, which mattered. She had royal blood through George III. She had trained herself to move through drawing rooms and poor districts alike without flinching. She had the look of a woman who would not make trouble. The matchmaking began in the way royal matchmaking always does, through dinners and weekends and gatherings where everyone pretended they were simply spending time together rather than negotiating a dynasty. The candidate they had in mind was Prince Albert Victor, known in the family as Eddie, eldest son of the Prince of Wales and second in line to the throne. Eddie was handsome and amiable and not particularly deep, and history has not treated him gently. He died before he could reign, which is the only fact about him that matters to this story. May and Eddie became engaged in December 1891. Queen Victoria approved. The families were pleased. And then, 6 weeks after the engagement was announced, Eddie fell ill with influenza. By January 14, 1892, he was dead of pneumonia. He was not yet 28. May found herself in a position that had no graceful name. She was not quite a widow, because she had not become a wife. She was not quite free, because she was publicly attached to a dead prince, and to a family that was not ready to release her. She was useful, which is a word that sounds kind, and is not always meant that way. It was Prince George, Eddie's younger brother, who eventually came into view as the practical resolution. George was a naval officer, shorter than Eddie, and considerably more disciplined in character. He had the quality of a man who shows up and does the work, without needing to be admired for it. He was shy in public and direct in private. And he had been fond of May for years in the honest way that sometimes develops between people who have known each other a long time within a small circle. They became engaged in 1893 and married that July at the Chapel Royal, St. James's Palace. The public accepted the narrative of a love that had survived grief and emerged into something stable. Those who knew the family accepted the more practical narrative. The dynasty had needed a bride, and May was still available, still suitable, and still willing to manage the enormous act of surrender with the composure that had always been her most reliable quality. What that composure cost her is harder to say, because she did not say it. Queen Mary was not a woman who invited others into her interior life. She wrote letters that were careful and correct. She kept diaries that recorded events without rendering verdicts. She expressed feeling through objects and architecture and the arrangement of rooms, which are forms of expression that leave very little room for other people to argue back. George V loved her in his own restrained way. He trusted her completely, which mattered more to him than most things. They were suited to each other in the way that two people who share a fundamental belief in the same set of values are suited, not by temperament, which was different on both sides, but by conviction. They both believed the crown was a sacred responsibility. They both believed personal feeling must yield to public duty. They were both more comfortable with structure than with emotional chaos. She ran the household. She organized the rituals. She collected objects with a systematic intensity that courtiers would describe decades later as somewhere between curatorial and coercive. She was formidable in the way that certain women become formidable, not through loudness or dramatic action, but through an absolute clarity about what mattered and who was allowed near it. She also raised 5 sons and a daughter, and in those children she planted the same seeds that had shaped her. Duty first, feeling managed, appearance maintained. She was not a warm mother in the conventional sense. She did not throw her arms around her children when they came into a room. She expressed affection through teaching, through high expectation, through the conviction that preparing someone properly for the life ahead of them was the most loving thing you could do. Whether that logic held up depends entirely on who was receiving it. Her youngest child, John, who had epilepsy and was removed from public life at an early age, probably experienced it differently than her eldest, Edward, who experienced it differently again. Edward, who was called David within the family, was born in 1894. He was the first son, the heir, the one who would carry the crown. From the beginning, he had a quality that made rooms tilt toward him, a brightness and a restlessness that was charming on the surface and exhausting underneath. He wanted attention, and he wanted it to feel like love, and those two things are not always the same. Queen Mary's relationship with David was complicated in the way that relationships between very similar and very different people tend to be complicated. She understood him in some ways and could not understand him in others. She saw his charm, and she saw the emotional dependence beneath it. She saw his restlessness, and she recognized that it was in some ways her own restlessness, the narrow strip between privilege and insecurity energy that she had channeled into discipline, while he channeled his into pleasure. She tried to teach him what she had taught herself. Personal feeling yields to public duty. The crown exists before you, and will exist after you. Your job is to be the vessel, not the subject. Duty is not a constraint, it is a form of freedom. Because a man who knows exactly what is required of him is a man who does not have to make very many frightening choices. David did not receive this lesson. Or rather, he received it and spent much of his adult life arguing with it from a safe distance, usually in the company of married women who were perfectly happy to make him feel understood in exchange for the considerable pleasures of his company. He was, by any honest accounting, the most magnetic public figure Britain produced in the first half of the 20th century. After the First World War, the empire needed a face that looked like the future rather than the past, and David was that face. He toured Canada and Australia and South Africa and India, and crowds gathered in numbers that still read as extraordinary. He shook hands with veterans and stood in mines and listened to unemployed workers with what appeared to be genuine attention. He wore clothes as if they had been designed around him personally, which they often had. He made fashionable things fashionable and made fashionable things look effortless. Behind the public spectacle, the people who worked for him closely saw a different picture. He was careless about paperwork. He disliked being told no. He liked late nights, fast company, expensive things, and the company of people who could make his private life feel like a party, where he was always the guest of honor. He expected houses to be warm and dinners to be perfect, and the staff to be invisible until needed. And if anything went wrong, he looked for the nearest person to hold responsible. He gravitated, from his early 20s, toward women who were older than him, married, experienced, and beyond his reach in the specific way that made his attachment feel like devotion rather than demand. The first great attachment was to Freda Dudley Ward, a society woman with a soft voice and a husband in Parliament. He wrote to her constantly, called her his angel, phoned her multiple times on the evenings they spent apart. He was with her, in the way that his world understood such arrangements, from 1918 through the late 1920s. Queen Mary was aware of Freda. She was not pleased about Freda. She was not pleased in the particular way that a woman who has spent her entire adult life doing what the institution required is not pleased when her eldest son treats the institution as something you can temporarily set aside when someone makes you feel understood. She said very little about it directly. She had learned, as the mothers of difficult men often learn, that opposition produces determination. If she said too much about Freda Dudley Ward, David would find a way to hold on to her more fiercely as a point of principle. So she waited, and she watched, and she did what she always did. She arranged the furniture of her life into the best order possible, and sat in her chair, and waited for events to move at their own speed. Frida was eventually replaced, in the early 1930s, by Lady Thelma Furness, an American who was married to Viscount Furness and who brought David into a social circle that included her friend Wallis Simpson. This is how these things begin, always, not with a thunderclap, always with a seating plan. George V died on January 20, 1936. His last coherent words were reportedly a question about Bognor Regis, the seaside town he had visited for his health. The precise words are disputed, and they do not matter to this story. What matters is that at midnight, with the king fading, his doctor administered a fatal dose of morphine and cocaine to ensure a death that would be reported in the morning papers rather than the evening ones. The doctor wrote in his notes that the king's life was terminated to preserve the dignity of dying. He also wanted the news to break in the Times rather than the less appropriate evening journals, which tells you a great deal about how differently the world organized its priorities in 1936. Edward VIII became king in the dark of that January night. He inherited the throne, the burden, the paperwork, and the problem of Wallis Simpson. He was 41 years old. He had been the Prince of Wales for 25 years. He had waited a very long time for a job he did not entirely want. And somewhere in Paris or in Fort Belvedere, or in the social circuits of a London winter, Wallis Simpson, who had been Mrs. Wallis Simpson for several years and had recently decided she was not entirely certain she wanted to stay that way, was about to become the most discussed woman in the world. She had not asked for that distinction. She would spend the rest of her life arguing about whether she had ever wanted it at all. To understand why Queen Mary hated her, you have to understand what Wallis was and what she represented. And to understand that, you have to go back to a cottage on the Pennsylvania-Maryland border in the summer of 1896. Bessie Wallace Warfield was born on June 19, 1896, in a resort town called Blue Ridge Summit in Pennsylvania. Her parents had gone there to help treat her father's tuberculosis. He died 5 months after she was born. He left behind a wife and an infant daughter and no reliable income, and Alice Montague Warfield spent the years that followed dependent on the charity of her wealthy brother-in-law, Solomon Davies Warfield, who was a successful Baltimore businessman and who paid for everything, including, eventually, Wallis's education at Oldfield School, the most expensive girls' school in Maryland. From the beginning, the girl who would one day cause the greatest constitutional crisis in modern British history understood what it meant to be maintained by someone else's money. She knew what it meant to have a social position that depended on a benefactor's continued goodwill. She knew what it meant to be near wealth rather than to have it. These are the same lessons Queen Mary had learned in the borrowed rooms at Kensington Palace, which is one of the more unsettling symmetries in this story. Wallis dropped the name Bessie in her youth. It sounded to her like something that did not fit her intentions. She was Wallis, and Wallis she remained, a name crisp enough to announce that she had decided who she was before anyone else had the chance to decide for her. She was not conventionally beautiful by the standards of her era. She was slim and angular and very well dressed, with a jaw that was distinctively strong and eyes that paid close attention to everything around her. She was quick and funny and had an excellent memory. She remembered names and preferences and the specific things people had said in previous conversations, which is a quality that passes for warmth when it is actually a form of discipline. She married Earl Winfield Spencer, Jr. in November 1916. He was a U.S. Navy aviator, handsome and charming, and in a certain direction of light very romantic. He was also an alcoholic, and the marriage, which was never without tension, deteriorated across several years of separation and sporadic reunion until they finally divorced in 1927. Before the divorce was final, Wallis spent over a year in China, in Peking and Shanghai, in the social world of the expatriate community that inhabited those cities in the 1920s. She called it her Lotus Year, after the Homeric lotus eaters who floated through a state of dreamy forgetfulness. She was not dreamy in any lasting sense. She came back from China more confident, more cosmopolitan, and in possession of an understanding of social power that she had refined through close observation of people who exercised it in very high-stakes settings. She met Ernest Aldrich Simpson in 1926. He was an American-born British subject working in the shipping business, a quiet and cultivated man with good manners and a certain dry intelligence, and no particular difficulty with the idea of a wife who was more socially ambitious than himself. They married in July 1928 and moved to London, where Ernest's business connections opened doors into a set of circles that Wallis found congenial and began to work. By the early 1930s, she was a confident and well-liked hostess in upper-class London society. She gave dinners that people wanted to attend. She had opinions that she expressed cleanly and without apology. She could silence a room with a remark that landed just on the right side of cruel. Men found her magnetic. Women were sometimes less certain, which is usually a sign that the women were paying closer attention. She was first presented at court on June 10, 1931, a formality that required obtaining official proof that she was the innocent party in her divorce from Win Spencer. She had to submit paperwork to the Lord Chamberlain's office to demonstrate that the previous marriage had ended through no fault of her own. She submitted the required documents and was duly presented. It was the only time in her life that she appeared before both King George V and Queen Mary at the same time. Wallis wrote later that it was the briefest of encounters, a few words of pleasantry, and nothing that could be called a real conversation. She was impressed by what she called their Majesty's gift for making everyone they met feel at ease. Queen Mary, one suspects, had no particular feeling about Wallis Warfield Spencer Simpson beyond the vague awareness that she was one more name on a long list of people who needed to be processed through an official occasion. That indifference would not last long. The meeting between Wallis and Edward happened through Lady Furness's social circle in January 1931, the same year as the court presentation, though sources differ slightly on exact timing. By 1934, the attachment had shifted from the territory of the prince's characteristic affection for a married woman and into something that alarmed the people around him. He followed her lead in conversation. He deferred to her preferences. He altered plans for her. He sent her jewelry that cost small fortunes. Queen Mary, who had an eye for jewels that bordered on the encyclopedic, noticed the jewelry. She showed some of Edward's gifts to Mabel Ogilvy, the Countess of Airlie, who was her lady of the bedchamber and one of the few people she trusted with anything resembling a candid observation. "He gives Mrs. Simpson the most beautiful jewels," she told Lady Airlie. "I am so afraid that he may ask me to receive her." The fear was specific. Queen Mary was not afraid of Wallis as a personal danger. She was afraid of what receiving her would mean, what it would signal to the family and the court and the institutional machinery that depended on the monarch's behavior reflecting a certain set of values. To receive Wallis officially would be to normalize the attachment. To normalize the attachment was to begin the process of accepting it, and Queen Mary could not accept it because she had spent 60 years operating on the principle that the personal must yield to the duty, and the duty required a king whose private life did not make governments nervous. She need not have worried about the invitation just yet. The year 1935 passed without it coming, and then January 1936 arrived, and George V died, and Edward was king, and the question of what Queen Mary feared became, rather suddenly, the only question that mattered to anyone in the palace. The world did not immediately know about Wallis Simpson. The British press was operating on the old understanding, which was really a habit of class solidarity and institutional self-protection, that certain things about royalty were simply not reported. Foreign newspapers had been covering the affair for months. American papers had it. Continental gossip had been thick with it since 1934. But in Britain, the editors of major newspapers had come to an informal arrangement with the palace, an arrangement that had no written terms and no formal enforcement mechanism, and operated purely on the assumption that everyone involved understood why the king's private life was nobody else's business. This arrangement held until December 1936, when it stopped holding. In the months between Edward's accession and the autumn of 1936, Queen Mary watched her son move through the first months of his reign with the careful attention of a woman who had been observing the machinery of monarchy for longer than most people had been alive. She saw him handle some things well. She saw him fail at others. She saw that Wallis was present at events where no unofficial companion should have been present, visible at dinners and weekends in ways that were impossible to pretend not to notice. She also saw that her son, who was now 50 years old, showed no sign of whatever gradual maturation she had been expecting his sense of responsibility to eventually produce. He was still capable of charm and still incapable of the grinding, disciplined dullness of constitutional duty, the careful reading of papers, the attendance at briefings, the 100 small acts of deference to convention that constitute the job when no ceremony is happening and no crowd is watching. She did not speak to him directly about Wallis. She told Lady Airlie that she had not liked to raise the subject with David in the first place, because she did not want to appear to interfere in his private life, and also because he was, as she said plainly, the most obstinate of all her sons. To oppose him over anything was only to make him more determined to do it. This is an interesting admission from a woman who is remembered primarily for her severity. She had learned something about her eldest child that required a particular kind of patience, that he could not be moved by frontal argument. He could only be outlasted or outmaneuvered, or, in the end, allowed to make the choice that collapsed the ground beneath his feet. The ground was collapsing by November. Wallis's divorce from Ernest Simpson was filed in October 1936. A decree nisi was granted. In 6 months, if nothing intervened, she would be free to remarry. Edward had already told his Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, that he intended to marry her. Baldwin told him the government could not accept such a marriage. The Dominion governments were consulted. They agreed with Baldwin. The Archbishop of Canterbury agreed with Baldwin. The court agreed with Baldwin. The newspapers, who were now running the story that could no longer be contained, discovered that a significant portion of the British public agreed with Baldwin. And Edward, who had spent his entire life finding ways around the things he did not want to do, finally discovered something that could not be gone around. On the evening of November 16th, he went to dinner with his mother at Marlborough House. He told her he intended to marry Mrs. Simpson. He told her he would abdicate if the government refused to accept the marriage. He asked her to receive Wallis. Queen Mary refused. He asked her why. She said, because she is an adventuress. 4 words. The choice of noun is worth sitting with. An adventuress, in the vocabulary of Queen Mary's generation, was not simply a woman who sought adventure in the geographical sense. It was a woman who used romantic attachment as a mechanism of social advancement. It was a woman who worked her way through the world by attaching herself to men of means or status, extracting what she needed, and moving forward. It implied calculation. It implied a fundamental inauthenticity in the relationship, a performance of attachment designed to produce a practical outcome. Queen Mary had chosen the word carefully. She almost always chose words carefully. What she was saying, behind the noun, was that she believed Wallis Simpson had recognized in Edward VIII the best opportunity she would ever have, and had pursued it with the cold efficiency of someone who had been surviving on other people's resources since childhood. She was saying that the attachment was not what Edward believed it to be. Whether she was right is a question that historians have been arguing since 1936. What is certain is that she believed it, and that the belief made the subsequent years of her life considerably harder to endure. When Edward left Marlborough House that night, Queen Mary sat with what she had been told. The conversation had gone the way she had feared it would go. Her son had not listened. He had not taken in anything she said. He had heard her objections the way a man hears objections when he has already decided that objections are not going to change anything. She wrote to him afterward. The letter was measured. It expressed her views without abandoning the formality that was the only emotional register available to her in writing. She told him she was horrified. She told him the marriage was impossible. She told him that from the point of view of the country, of the empire, of the monarchy, and of the family, this was a path that led nowhere she could follow him. He wrote back. He was not dismissive, exactly. He was certain. He had the certainty of a man who had decided that the thing he wanted was the right thing to want, and who was intelligent enough to construct a framework of feeling around that certainty that looked from the inside like conviction and from the outside like stubbornness. The abdication was not going to be prevented by Queen Mary's horror, or by her letters, or by the dinner at Marlborough House. The only question was how long it would take to become official. It took less than a month. The question people ask about Queen Mary, when they examine the depth and duration of her coldness toward the Duchess of Windsor, is whether it was personal or institutional, whether she hated Wallis the woman or Wallis the threat to the crown. The honest answer is that Queen Mary, by November 1936, could no longer tell the difference. She had become the monarchy, in the way that people who dedicate themselves entirely to an institution eventually become the institution. She had married into the job in 1893, spent the next 4 decades performing it, with a consistency that bordered on the fanatical, and along the way she had absorbed its requirements so thoroughly that her own preferences and the Crown's requirements had stopped being two separate things. When she said duty, she was not speaking abstractly. She meant something specific, and worked out over decades. She had buried a fiancé at 24, and transferred her engagement to his younger brother within 18 months. She had sat beside a husband who ran Britain's fleet through the First World War, who lost a son at sea, who saw the great European royal houses collapse one after another across the 1910s, and who spent the last years of his life quietly terrified that the monarchy he had spent 50 years maintaining was more fragile than it appeared. She had watched the Romanovs, her cousins, shot in a basement. She had watched the German Kaiser, another cousin, flee to the Netherlands and die in exile. She had watched crowns fall across Europe like china from a shaking shelf. She had also survived. And survival at that level, in those particular circumstances, produces a very specific kind of person. A person who believes that the institution matters more than the individual, not because the institution is lovable, but because it is the only thing standing between the order she depends on and the chaos she has watched claim everything else. George V's death in January 1936 had been devastating to her in ways she expressed through behavior rather than through words. She supervised the accession arrangements with her usual precision. She moved her household from Buckingham Palace to Marlborough House, the London residence that had been associated with Queen Alexandra, her late mother-in-law, which meant overseeing the physical logistics of a royal household move. She attended the funeral. She conducted herself without visible collapse. But she had lost her husband of 43 years, the man who had trusted her more than he trusted anyone else, and she had simultaneously passed the crown to the son she was most afraid of, the one who had always known how to charm a room and never quite learned why the room mattered. She watched Edward's first months as king with the particular dread of someone who has been waiting for a specific disaster and is now watching it approach. He dismissed the careful protocols his father had maintained. He arrived late to engagements. He waved away briefings. He was careless with state papers, which his father's private secretary Alec Hardinge found so concerning that he eventually wrote the king a private letter warning him that his relationship with Wallis Simpson was going to produce a confrontation with the government. The king read the letter and felt betrayed. Hardinge, who was trying to save Edward from himself, was removed from his confidence for the act of trying. Queen Mary watched all of this. She did not intervene publicly. She could not. The moment a dowager queen begins making public statements about the reigning monarch's fitness for office, you have a constitutional emergency of a different and potentially worse kind. She handled it the way she handled everything she could not fix directly. She watched, and she waited, and she kept her own counsel, and she prayed in the specific manner of someone who was not entirely certain that prayer was going to be sufficient. By October 1936, it was clear that prayer was not going to be sufficient. The court had been managing the Wallis question informally for over a year. People who appeared at events with her were not always people who appeared at events where the king's family would be present. Invitations were calibrated to avoid the awkward meeting that everyone could see coming. The king himself seemed to assume that if he simply proceeded, the people around him would adjust. Some of them adjusted. Wallis had become, in certain circles, a figure of real social power, partly because of her own genuine capabilities, and partly because proximity to the king is itself a form of currency that devalues everyone else's money. People curried favor with her. People sent her gifts. People invited her to things they might not have invited her to otherwise. not because they particularly wanted her there, but because wanting to be near the king meant wanting to be near whoever the king wanted to be near. Queen Mary watched this too. She watched it with the expression of someone who has been around long enough to know what social currency eventually costs the people who spend it, and who is waiting for the bill to arrive. It arrived, as bills always arrive, faster than anyone had quite expected. The divorce petition from Ernest Simpson was filed in October. The British press, which had been sustaining its unusual silence on the matter, began to crack. Foreign newspapers were filling in the cracks. Visiting diplomats from Europe and America were quietly horrified that their British counterparts were still pretending not to notice something that everyone else in the world had been reading about for months. Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, finally went to see the king and told him plainly what the government's position was. The marriage could not happen. If the king proceeded, the government would resign. A general election would follow. The country would go to the polls on the question of whether the king should be allowed to marry his mistress, and that election would be fought by a government that opposed him. Edward did not believe this would actually happen. He had spent his life watching systems bend for him. He believed the constitutional machinery was ultimately more pliable than the people operating it were letting on. He was wrong. Queen Mary had one more conversation with him, in December, when it was already over, in all the ways that mattered. He told her the abdication would take place the following day. She was, according to the accounts of people who were in proximity to Marlborough House that day, overheard to exclaim, "To give up all this for that." The "that" is doing considerable work in that sentence. The instrument of abdication was signed at Fort Belvedere on the morning of December 10, 1936. Edward signed it. His three brothers, Albert, Henry, and George, signed it as witnesses. The king, who had been on the throne for 325 days, was, as of 11 o'clock that morning, no longer king. Albert, the second son, became George VI. His wife Elizabeth, the former Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, became queen consort. Their daughter Elizabeth, aged 10, became heir presumptive. Their daughter Margaret, aged 6, became second in line. The family that had expected to remain peripheral to the machinery of succession was now at its centre. That evening, Edward gave his farewell broadcast from Windsor Castle. He spoke plainly and with considerable emotion, and whatever else you might say about his judgment and his character, the speech was good. He said he had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge his duties as king as he would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman he loved. He thanked his family. He thanked his people. He said he was going. Queen Mary issued a statement of her own through Marlborough House. She said she was deeply grieved for what had occurred and that she commended to her people the new king and queen. She said it because it was required. She meant it because she had always meant what she was required to say, which is what made her reliable, in a way that made her useful, and sometimes made her terrible. She did not see Edward before he left the country. There was a dinner at Royal Lodge on December 11, at which family members gathered for what was effectively a farewell meal. Queen Mary attended. The evening is described by those who were present as deeply uncomfortable. Edward was cheerful, in the way that people are cheerful when they have made a decision and are defending it to themselves by performing confidence. His brothers were not cheerful. His mother was not cheerful. According to various accounts, Edward kissed his mother's hand at the end of the evening. She held herself together until he left the room. Whether she broke down afterward is not something the official record confirms. It would be very unlike her to have broken down in any way that anyone else witnessed. What we know she did was write to him, later, when she had had enough time to think through what she wanted to say. The letter she sent in July 1938, roughly a year and a half after the abdication, is one of the most important documents in this story, because it is one of the few places where Queen Mary put her feelings into words that survived her. She wrote, "You will remember how miserable I was when you informed me of your intended marriage and abdication, and how I implored you not to do so for our sake and for the sake of the country. You did not seem able to take in anything or to listen to any advice. I do not think you have ever realized the shock which the attitude you took up caused your family and the whole nation." She closed with, "My feelings for you as your mother remain the same, and our being parted and the cause of it grieve me beyond words. After all All my life I have put my country before everything else, and I simply cannot change now. Two things in that letter are worth noting. The first is that she was still writing to him at all, 18 months later, which tells you that the relationship was not simply severed, it was injured, and continuing in the particular painful way of injuries that will not close properly. The second is the phrase, "I simply cannot change now." She was not pretending to be incapable of change. She was saying that changing, at 81, after a lifetime organized around a principle, would constitute a betrayal of everything that had made her who she was. She could love him. She grieved for him. She could not pretend that what he had done was anything other than what it was. What it was, in her understanding, was abandonment. He had abandoned the throne, yes, but more than that, he had abandoned the story she had spent her entire life telling about what monarchy required and why it mattered. He had said, in the clearest possible way, that his personal happiness was more important than the obligation he had been born to fulfill. That was not just a constitutional failure, it was a personal affront to 60 years of her own choices. Her choices, too, had cost her things. She had transferred her engagement to a brother she had not chosen. She had given up whatever romantic narrative she might have constructed for herself in favor of a suitable arrangement. She had kept personal feeling off the public stage for decades. She had put her country before everything else, as she told him, and he had told her, in effect, that putting your country before everything else was not actually required, that you could choose differently, that the choice was valid. She could not accept that argument, because accepting it would have meant she had wasted the sacrifice. And the woman at the center of the argument, the woman who had watched him make it, was Wallis Simpson, who was now, as of June 3, 1937, the Duchess of Windsor. The peculiarity of Queen Mary's public image, in her own time and in the decades since, is how consistently people described the same qualities and reached opposite conclusions about whether those qualities were admirable or alarming. Lady Cynthia Asquith, who moved in the same social circles, described her as someone whose dignity was so complete it sometimes felt like a climate change, a drop in temperature that altered the atmosphere of any room she entered. The Countess of Airlie, who was closer to her than almost anyone, described the same quality with more warmth. She said Queen Mary was the most misunderstood woman she had ever known, that what read as cold was actually controlled, and that the control was what made it possible for her to survive the things she survived. Harold Nicholson, the writer and diplomat who observed her at court functions across decades and who was usually precise in his assessments, wrote that she reminded him of the great empresses of the 18th century, not merely royal, but something the court organized itself around, a gravitational fact that people navigated the way they navigate large fixed objects in a familiar landscape. He meant it as a compliment, roughly. Queen Mary, who had a sense of humor that she deployed very sparingly in public, would probably have accepted it as one. The collecting habit, which became something of a legend in courtly circles, deserves extended attention because it tells you more about how she operated than most other documented behaviors. She did not collect randomly or compulsively or without principle. She collected within a specific framework. She was interested in objects that had a royal provenance, that had once been in royal possession and had somehow drifted into private hands, and she felt a genuine proprietary conviction that such objects belonged to the crown and ought to be returned to it. Whether this conviction was aesthetically motivated or dynastically motivated or simply a rationalization of an acquisitive nature is something the people who observed her close up were unable to agree on. What they agreed on was the outcome. When Queen Mary admired something in your home, you eventually gave it to her, and the exchange was conducted with such impeccable social form that it was impossible to complain about afterward without looking ungracious. Household staff at royal residences during her years at Buckingham Palace and Windsor and Sandringham knew, as a matter of practical operational wisdom, that Queen Mary took note of things. She would walk through rooms and pick up objects and examine them with the concentration of someone who was conducting a private inventory, and she would set them back down with the expression of a woman who had made a decision about where they really ought to be. The decision sometimes materialized, sometimes in the form of a polite request, sometimes in the form of a gift of something else, sometimes simply in the object appearing, at a later date, in her possession, without formal negotiation having been visible from the outside. This behavior was annoying to some, amusing to others, and to those who thought carefully about it, revealing. It was the behavior of a woman who had grown up watching beautiful things belong to other people, and who had internalized a conviction that beauty and permanence and royal continuity were so deeply connected that objects with a royal past belonged in a royal present. It was also, and she probably knew this, the behavior of a woman who had grown up without quite enough, and who had been compensating ever since. She did not collect jewels in the casual manner of women who wear them because they are pretty. She wore them the way a general wears medals, as the accumulated record of a life lived at a particular level of consequence. She knew the provenance of every piece. She knew who had given what, to whom, and on what occasion. She kept meticulous records. She had opinions, sometimes very forceful ones, about where pieces should go after her death and why. This is worth establishing at length, because it helps explain the jewelry dimension of the Windsor conflict. When Edward gave Queen Mary's gifts to Wallis, he was not simply being generous with his personal possessions. In Queen Mary's accounting, he was misappropriating elements of the royal record, placing the physical evidence of the dynasty's history in the hands of the woman she had declared unworthy of it. It was the same logic as the HRH denial, applied to material objects. You do not allow the woman who broke the line of succession to wear the emblems of the dynasty she broke. The psychological texture of what Edward felt for Wallis Simpson has been analysed by every biographer who has approached the subject, and the analyses vary so dramatically that the safest conclusion is that the people doing the analysing were reading different things into the available evidence. What is consistent across the documentary record is that Edward's attachment to Wallis was qualitatively different from his previous attachments, and that the difference was not simply intensity. He had been intensely attached to Freda Dudley Ward and to Thelma Furness. What made Wallis different was something about the dynamic itself, something in the specific quality of the relationship that gave it a hold on him that the previous ones had not had. People who observed them together consistently noted that Wallis did not behave the way women in Edward's life had typically behaved. She did not treat him as a sacred object or a national treasure. She managed him. She corrected him, in the way that a person corrects someone they are genuinely responsible for, rather than someone they are trying to impress. She told him when she thought he was being foolish. She organized his social life in ways he might not have organized it himself. She created, in the domestic arrangements of Fort Belvedere and later in France, the kind of environment that a man who has always been surrounded by deference finds unexpectedly restful, precisely because it contains at least one person who is not deferring. Whether Wallis found this role satisfying is unclear from the documents. What is clear from her correspondence, particularly from letters she wrote to friends during the crisis months of late 1936, is that she was alarmed by the direction the relationship was heading before it reached its conclusion. She did not want him to abdicate. She wrote to him, urging him not to abdicate. She issued a public statement saying she was willing to withdraw from the situation if it would resolve the crisis. He did not take the exit she offered him. Her letters from the period immediately after the abdication, when she was at the Villa Louviers in Cannes waiting for the divorce to be finalized, while the former king was at various English country houses, doing whatever former kings do in the immediate aftermath of ceasing to be kings, contain a note of genuine distress. She had not planned for this. She had been managing a complicated situation with the skills she had, and the situation had outgrown the management. She wrote to Ernest Simpson, her second husband, with more candor than she could express to almost anyone else. Ernest, who was by general account a more estimable person than his role in this story requires him to be, responded with the kind of dry equanimity that defines certain people's approach to being used catastrophically as a means to someone else's end. He noted that they had not been careful enough in picking daughters-in-law. After all, we have not got kings to hand out left and right. Ernest's observation is wry enough to suggest that he had processed what had happened to him with more humor than bitterness, which is either impressive or a sign of emotional complications that would take a different kind of biography to properly explore. He remarried, shortly after the divorce was final, his replacement wife being Mary Kirk, the American woman who had been Wallis's close friend, and who later wrote in her diary, that she believed Wallis had used their friendship in ways she found both bewildering and hurtful. The network of people who had been moved around by the Wallis-Edward attachment, like furniture rearranged to accommodate a new arrival, is one of the less examined parts of this story. Ernest Simpson, who had a perfectly good life until his wife became indispensable to a king. Mary Kirke, who found her friendship with Wallis entangled in adultery and blame. Thelma Furness, who introduced them and was subsequently cast out of Edward's circle with the abruptness of someone whose purpose has been served. Herman Rogers and his wife, who sheltered Wallis in France during the crisis and who remained her loyal friends afterward, at some cost to their own social standing. Behind the great drama of kings and queens and constitutional crises, there are these quieter people, managing the consequences of someone else's choices with the limited tools available to people who did not make the choices but are living in the aftermath. Queen Mary, who was not generally interested in the interior lives of people below a certain rank, had no particular framework for thinking about most of these people. She was focused on the consequences for the institution, for her family, and for the specific people in her family whom she could see most clearly. But the network of disruption around the abdication was very wide, and the woman at the center of it was, depending on your angle of observation, either a scheming adventuress or a capable woman who had been pulled into something she had not designed and who managed what she was given with the practical skill of a person who had always relied on her wits more than her circumstances. Queen Mary chose the first interpretation. She held to it. The evidence does not entirely support it, and it does not entirely refute it, which is generally the nature of evidence about complicated people. The 11 months of Edward VI's reign are the most examined 11 months in modern British royal history, and for good reason. They produced the only voluntary abdication of a British monarch in the contemporary period. They reshaped the succession in ways that are still being felt, and they did it with a speed and drama that left virtually everyone involved feeling that events had moved faster than their ability to respond to them. George V died on January 20th. Edward learned of his father's death while staying at Sandringham, where the family had gathered knowing the end was near. He became king at the moment of his father's last breath. He was 51 years old. He had been Prince of Wales since he was 16. He had been waiting for this office, in some sense dreading it, for 35 years. The first thing he did as king, according to multiple accounts, was order the clocks at Sandringham to be put back to the correct time. This requires explanation. George V had kept the Sandringham clocks set 30 minutes fast as a system for encouraging hunting punctuality, a habit that had been in place for decades and that the staff maintained as a ritual of royal peculiarity. Edward thought it was nonsense and said so immediately. The gesture was very small. Its meaning was large. He was changing something his father had maintained for its own sake, something that had no justification beyond the king's preference, and he was doing it on the day of his father's death, before the body was cold. The people around him noted it. The people around him were always noting things. In the following weeks, the new court adjusted to a very different style. Edward did not like paperwork, red boxes, the leather-covered dispatch cases in which state papers are sent to the monarch for reading and signing, accumulated in rooms where they had previously been cleared promptly. Private secretaries who had worked under George V found themselves unable to get the new king's attention for matters they considered pressing. He was available for the things he wanted to be available for, and less available for the rest. He attended the opening of Parliament. He carried out public engagements with the facility that came from decades of practice. He was popular in ways that the official court found reassuring and occasionally unsettling, because popularity that comes from being charming, rather than from being reliable, is a different kind of asset. The country loved him. The country had loved him for 20 years. The question of whether the country would continue to love him if it knew what the people around him knew was one that nobody was quite ready to test. Wallis was present at Fort Belvedere through the winter and spring. She was present at social events that the king attended. She was, in the London that kept track of such things, the dominant fact of the king's private life, in a way that was becoming harder to contain within the informal understanding that protected royal privacy from press scrutiny. In April, Edward took a private holiday in the Mediterranean that caused the first significant public exposure of the relationship. He was aboard a chartered yacht, the Nahlin, with a party that included Wallis. The party travelled through the Adriatic and Aegean. Foreign newspapers reported it extensively. Photographs showed the king with a woman who was clearly more than a casual acquaintance. The British press still said very little. But the informal protection was becoming more precarious with each week. Members of Parliament began asking questions. Members of the clergy began writing letters. Members of the government began having conversations with each other about what was going to happen and what should be done about it. Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, was a man of considerable political experience and genuine awkwardness about the conversation he knew was eventually going to need to happen. He had been managing British politics through periods of extraordinary stress, the general strike of 1926, the economic crisis of the early 1930s, the rise of European dictatorships. He had survived these things by being careful and by being patient, and by being willing to do unpleasant things with a public composure that looked like ease and was actually a very expensive form of courage. He finally went to see the king in October 1936. The conversation was formal and uncomfortable. Baldwin told the king that the government could not support a marriage to Mrs. Simpson. He was told that the king intended to proceed anyway. The conversation ended without resolution, which was the worst possible outcome for everyone except the people who had not yet decided what they wanted to do. The divorce petition filed by Ernest Simpson was heard in late October in Ipswich, a deliberate choice of venue designed to avoid the London press concentration. A decree nisi was granted. In 6 months, the divorce would be absolute. Wallis would be free to remarry. The British press, which had been maintaining its unusual silence through the summer and autumn, began to crack in late November. The story broke in its full form in early December, when the Bishop of Bradford, Alfred Blunt, made a speech about the king's religious responsibilities that referenced, with careful obliqueness, the question of whether the king fully understood his responsibilities in that area. The speech was not about Wallis specifically. The press chose to interpret it as if it were. Within days, the story that had been an open secret for months was open without the secret. The public's response was more mixed than either side had expected. There was genuine support for the king among some sections of the population, particularly younger people, and those who found the monarchy remote and would have been happy to see it express something recognizable as human feeling. The pro-Edward position was summarized in various letters to newspapers as roughly, "He has served this country faithfully. He has a right to some personal happiness. Why not let the man marry who he wants?" The anti-Edward position, which was considerably stronger in Parliament, in the Church, in the Dominion governments, and in the court, was, "The king is not simply a man. The king is an office. The office has requirements. One of those requirements, given that the king is head of a church that does not recognize divorce, is that the king not marry a twice-divorced woman whose previous husbands are still alive. This is not a question of personal happiness. It is a constitutional requirement that the king be in a position to fulfill his constitutional role. Mrs. Simpson makes that impossible." Queen Mary, in Marlborough House, was watching all of this with an attention that could not relax. She had the intelligence of a woman who had spent 60 years in the machinery of the thing, and who knew exactly which levers were being pulled and why. She also had the particular dread of a mother who has known for some years that a crisis was coming, and who has been unable to prevent it. She wrote to Edward in those weeks. The letters that have survived are careful and formal, and contain the controlled grief of someone who has decided that controlled grief is the only form she can permit herself. She told him she was horrified. She told him she feared for the monarchy. She told him she implored him not to proceed. He wrote back with the courtesy of a man who is being deeply polite about the fact that he is not going to listen to a word of what she says. The final family conversation happened on the evening of December 7, when Edward went to Fort Belvedere and his brothers George and Harry came to see him. Albert was not present for that particular evening, but the Duke of Kent, Prince George, was, and he reportedly tried to persuade Edward to reconsider, or at least to understand the weight of what he was doing to the people he was leaving behind with the decision. The conversation, by all accounts, achieved nothing. On December 10th, the instrument of abdication was signed. Edward met with his mother at Marlborough House on December 11th, the last time he would see her for several years. The accounts of that meeting are fragmentary, filtered through second-hand reports, and the careful management of what was and was not recorded. What is clear is that Queen Mary did not collapse, did not rage, did not express what she was feeling in any way that the people around her could easily classify and report. She held herself together. She had always held herself together. Holding herself together was the thing she was most skilled at, and it was the thing that, in that December room, must have cost more than it had ever cost before. He left England the next day. She did not see him off. Edward's farewell broadcast on the evening of December 11th, 1936, was one of the most listened-to radio broadcasts in British history to that point. He spoke from Windsor Castle, seated before a microphone in the Augusta Tower, surrounded by his private secretary and a BBC engineer. And he said things that millions of people heard, and that a significant number of them found genuinely moving. The speech was unusual. It was personal, in a way that royal public statements had not previously been personal. It did not pretend that constitutional difficulty was the reason for the departure. It said plainly that the difficulty was love, that he had found it impossible to carry the burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman he loved, and that this was therefore a situation without a good resolution, and he had chosen the resolution that was less good for the country and more good for himself. He thanked his family, his brothers, the Queen and Queen Mary. He expressed gratitude for what Britain had given him across his years of service. He said he was going, but that whatever happened, he would always be British and would always wish the country well. It was a good speech. It was memorable. It was also, from Queen Mary's perspective, a speech that made the most important argument he could have made, in the most publicly accessible possible way, for the benefit of people who would now be expected to feel sorry for him rather than angry at him. She had not been consulted about the content of the speech. She had not been shown a draft. She found out what it contained when she heard it, or when she was told about it, in the same way that the rest of the country found out. This was another of the small violations that accumulated into the larger one. She was the king's mother and the Dowager Queen, and she was told about her eldest son's abdication broadcast at the same time the public was told. Because he had decided that the people around him who might have argued about the content were not people whose arguments he was prepared to receive at that stage. She issued her own statement through Marlborough House on the morning of December 12. It was formal and brief, and carefully positioned. She expressed her grief for what had occurred, and her confidence in the new king and queen. She said the things that were required to be said. She said them with the correctness that had always been her public mode. She did not say that she had implored him not to do it. She did not say that she had warned him. She did not say that the woman he had left for was an adventuress who was not suitable to be received as royal. She said none of the things she had said in private, because private things were private, and the institution was not served by their public expression. She went to the investiture of George VI at an accession Privy Council on December 12. She attended the meetings she was required to attend. She fulfilled the obligations that fell to her in the immediate aftermath of a constitutional change she had not wanted and could not prevent. And then she went back to Marlborough House, and she did whatever she did in private when the public part of the day was over, and the record does not say. The mechanisms by which the royal family managed the Windsors' exclusion from official British life in the years after the abdication were not spectacular. They were bureaucratic and social and systematic, and they operated without needing to be announced. Invitations went out for official occasions. The Windsors' names were not on them. Protocol required the presence of working royals at certain events. The Windsors were not working royals. They were not present. The gap between the Duke and Duchess of Windsor were not invited, and the Duke and Duchess of Windsor were deliberately excluded, is a gap that the palace has never formally addressed, because formally addressing it would have required acknowledging that a deliberate choice was being made, and acknowledged deliberate choices require justification. The social exclusion operated at a level below the formal one. Hostesses who gave dinner parties understood that inviting the Windsors complicated the question of who else would attend, because some people would not attend if the Windsors were there, and some of those people were people you could not afford to exclude. The Windsors were not impossible to include in social events, but they required a specific social environment, one organized enough away from the royal court that the question of protocol did not arise. In France, where they spent most of their time, this was easier. The Windsors entertained at their house outside Paris and were a fixture in the social life of the Anglophone European set that inhabited that world in those decades. They knew the Duke and Duchess of Sutherland, the Rothschilds, various socialites and expatriates and artistic figures. They moved through that world with the ease of people who know how to make an environment comfortable and who have enough money and enough glamour to attract people who want to be near them. But they were not in Britain. The Britain part was always the difficulty. Every time Edward pressed for permission to come back, every time the question arose of whether a role might be found for him, the answer that came back from the palace and the government was some variation of "not yet," or "not in that capacity," or "not with those conditions attached." The closest he came to returning in any official capacity was in 1937, during the coronation period of George VI. He was in Britain for the final weeks of the abdication process and departed before the coronation was organized. He announced his engagement to Wallis the evening before the ceremony, which was interpreted in the palace as an attempt to divert attention from the event, and which did in fact produce significant newspaper coverage on a morning when all the newspaper coverage was supposed to be about the new king. Whether the announcement was deliberately timed or simply practically necessary, given the legal timeline of the divorce, is a question that different writers have answered differently. From inside the palace, the timing looked deliberate. From inside the Windsor household, the explanation was more mundane. The question of intent is impossible to resolve with available evidence. What is certain is that the coronation proceeded without them, and that the absence was noted, and that the photograph of the new king and queen and their two daughters on the balcony of Buckingham Palace after the ceremony, waving to the crowd, was one of the defining images of the British monarchy in the 20th century, a picture of a family that looked stable and intact, and in its right place. The Windsors, in France, were not in their right place, by anyone's public accounting. Their right place, in the framework Queen Mary and the palace had established, was precisely where they were, abroad, quiet, managing their exile with whatever dignity they could find in it, and not making trouble in ways that required the family to respond. They were not, in the event, very good at that last part. The relationship between Queen Mary and her eldest son, before 1936, was not warm in the conventional sense, but it was important to both of them in ways that are visible in the correspondence. Edward wrote to his mother from his various royal tours across the 1920s and 1930s with a regularity that suggests he wanted her to know what he was doing and where he was and what he thought about it. The letters are not emotionally confessional in the way that letters between some mothers and sons can be. They are reports, in a sense, the heir keeping the Queen informed of what the heir is experiencing. But they are detailed reports, and they contain moments of observation and humor that suggest he was writing to someone he thought would understand, not just to someone he thought required updating. Queen Mary's responses were supportive in the measured way of a woman who did not gush. She praised what she thought was praiseworthy. She expressed pride in ways that were calibrated enough to not embarrass him. She was interested in what he saw and where he went and what he concluded, and he knew she was interested, and so he told her. This communication pattern existed for years. It was damaged in the early 1930s by the Wallis situation, as the topic of his private life became one that both of them were reluctant to raise directly. By 1935 and 1936, the gap in the correspondence on that subject had become the dominant fact of their relationship. They wrote to each other about many things, and did not write about the only thing that mattered. When the crisis finally produced the direct conversation, it was too late for letters to carry it. They were talking face to face, in November 1936, about something that had been developing for years, and that she had watched approach without being able to turn it. After the abdication, the correspondence resumed, but differently. Her letters to him are more restrained, more careful, more formal, in the sense that formality serves as a protection against the feeling that would otherwise be visible. His letters to her are similarly careful, and when they are not careful they are sometimes complaining, which suggests that he had not entirely processed the fact that the person he was complaining to was one of the people most hurt by the situation he was complaining about. He complained about money. about the title for Wallis, about the family's reception of them, about the Bahamas, about being excluded from official occasions. He framed these complaints as injustices suffered, and in some cases they were injustices in a specific technical sense. But writing to his mother to tell her that the family was treating him badly was asking a woman who had told him exactly what would happen if he proceeded to confirm that the things that had happened were unfair. She did not confirm it. She responded with the evenness of a woman who had long since decided what she thought, and was not going to be persuaded to revise it. She told him she loved him. She told him she was grieved. She did not tell him he had been treated unfairly. He came to London in 1945, after the war, while Wallis remained in France. Queen Mary saw him at Marlborough House, which was the first time they had been in the same room since December 1936. 9 years. She was 87 years old, and he was 51. Whatever passed between them was conducted in private, in a room in a house in London, and it was not recorded in any document that has been made publicly available. He left London after his visit, and returned to France. The separation continued. She sent him birthday gifts. She answered his letters. She held the line. To understand why Queen Mary found the Wallis situation so particularly aggravating, it helps to trace the arc of Wallis's social ascent in the years before the abdication with some precision. Because the ascent was rapid and it was visible, and every stage of it was something that the people paying attention could mark. Wallis and Ernest Simpson arrived in London in the late 1920s and established themselves in a flat in Bryanston Court, a serviceable address in Marylebone that was not the grandest location in London, but was respectable and comfortable and adequate for the kind of entertaining they were doing. Ernest was in the shipping business. He had London connections. Wallis had what she had always had, the ability to manage a room. She learned British social customs with a thoroughness that impressed even people who were watching for the American awkwardness that was supposed to be inevitable. She learned which invitations to accept and which to send politely worded declines. She learned the names of the right hostesses and the right tailors and the right ways to compliment a piece of furniture or a garden, which in England is a social skill of the first order. She was quick and funny and had the dry observation of someone who had been watching rooms long enough to know exactly what the room was performing and why. She came to Thelma Furness's attention in the early 1930s. Thelma Furness was, at that point, the Prince of Wales's companion, which meant that her social circle included the Prince and people the Prince found entertaining, and that the Prince attended events where her friends were present. Wallis and Edward were first introduced in January 1931 at a house party in the country. The introduction was ordinary, nothing that anyone present noted at the time as significant. The significance developed gradually. They moved in overlapping social circles across the following years. Wallis was clever, and Edward was often bored, and clever people who are genuinely funny are more interesting to a bored man than most other things. She did not perform awe. She did not perform deference. She treated him, by multiple accounts, like a man rather than a prince, which is either a genuine quality or a very sophisticated strategy, and the distinction is not always visible from the outside. By 1934, the attachment had become a social fact that the people around Edward could not ignore. He talked about her. He went to places because she was going to be there. He adjusted his schedule for her. He sent her gifts. The gifts were extraordinary: diamonds, rubies, emeralds, sapphires, pieces from the family collection, pieces commissioned for her specifically. Lord Wigram, George V's private secretary, saw some of the pieces and found the scale of the giving alarming. Queen Mary heard about the giving. She expressed her alarm to Lady Airlie with the sentence about the beautiful jewels and the fear about receiving the woman. The fear was specific. She knew that reception would mean acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would mean a step towards something she could not accept. She was not ready, in 1934 or 1935, to have the direct conversation with Edward about what she feared. She had learned, across decades of managing her most difficult son, that opposition to anything he wanted produced the specific form of defiance that looks like conviction when it is actually stubbornness. If she told him she would not receive Wallis, she would be making the question formal, and making the question formal would force him to take a position on it, and his position on it was not going to be the position she wanted. So she waited. She told Lady Airlie her fears. She watched. She hoped that the attachment would follow the pattern of the previous ones, intensely held and eventually relinquished in the way that middle-aged men sometimes relinquish attachments that have become complicated. It did not follow the pattern. What she could not see from the outside, and what historians have subsequently had to piece together from the letters and diaries of people who were inside the situation, is that the Wallis-Edward dynamic had already crossed a threshold that made the previous pattern no longer applicable. He had told Wallis he loved her in terms that were unambiguous. He had started talking to her about his life as king in ways that gave her a role in his thinking that went beyond what a companion's role had previously included. He had decided, somewhere in the months of 1934 or 1935, that this was the relationship for which all the previous ones had been a preparation. The decision was made in the interior life of a man whose interior life was not, by his own account or by the accounts of people who knew him well, organized around forward planning. He felt it rather than deciding it, which is a way of saying he believed it was the thing he wanted, and from that belief, everything else followed. Queen Mary, from outside this, saw a pattern she recognized. She had seen men like this before. She had seen the particular combination of emotional dependence and social carelessness, and the conviction that personal desire was essentially the same thing as personal right. She had managed it in others. She had hoped to manage it in her own son. She had not counted on Wallis being good enough at what she did to make management impossible. George V's feelings about Wallis Simpson are less extensively documented than Queen Mary's, partly because he was less given to written expression, and partly because he died in January 1936, before the crisis reached its acute phase. But what is documented suggests that his concern was at least as profound as his wife's, if expressed in a characteristically different register. His health had been declining since 1928, when a severe respiratory illness came close to killing him, and he was never entirely well afterward. He carried the business of the throne through the 1930s, with the doggedness of a man who has decided that working himself to death is preferable to the alternative of living without working, which he would have found meaningless. He attended to state papers. He gave his Christmas broadcasts, which became an institution. He was present at public events to an extent that impressed even his doctors. He was also, as he aged, increasingly worried about his heir. He told a number of people, over the course of the early 1930s, that he did not believe David would last on the throne. The precise wording varies from account to account, but the substance is consistent. He feared that his son, for all his public gifts, did not have the interior equipment for the job, the fundamental conviction that the job mattered more than he did. He told the Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Lang, that he prayed God his eldest son would never marry and have children, because he hoped the throne would pass directly from himself to Albert, and then to Albert's daughter Elizabeth, who he believed had the character for it. This was not a casual remark. It was the kind of remark a king makes when he has been thinking about something seriously for a very long time. He also told Lord Hardinge that Wallis was a woman about whom he could say nothing good, a phrase notable for its deliberate restraint. He was not a man given to elaborating his disapproval. The restraint itself was the expression. He saw Wallis at a dinner party in 1935 and was reportedly not charmed. She sat near him and he was polite in the way he was always polite, and afterward he told someone, the account varies on who, that he could see what David saw in her without being able to explain what he was supposed to do about it. He was the king. He could not forbid his son from seeing a woman. He could make his disapproval clear, which he did, without it making any visible difference. He did not, in the end, have to deal with the final consequences. He died in January 1936, and the question of what he would have done had he lived into the crisis year is one of those unanswerable historical speculations that people find comforting to engage in, without the speculation producing any useful information. What it did produce, in the palace and in the family, was the particular grief of a family that had lost the head of the household at the precise moment when the household was about to need him most. Queen Mary lost not only her husband of 43 years, but the person whose authority could have been, Had things been different, the last check on what was coming. Without him, the only authority remaining was the prime ministers, the governments, the constitutions. Those were sufficient, in the end. But they could not do what a father might have done. Or perhaps they could have, and the father would have failed too. It is impossible to know. George V was not, by any account, a man who had successfully managed David's character in the years when managing it was still potentially possible. He had expressed disapproval, clearly and repeatedly, and it had not changed anything. Queen Mary tried something different in those years. She expressed concern rather than disapproval, which is slightly different in effect. She asked questions. She made herself available for conversation. She wrote letters that were warm enough to keep the communication open while making her position clear enough that he could not claim not to know it. None of it changed anything either. The abdication crisis did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in the specific political and international climate of late 1936, and understanding that climate helps explain why the stakes felt as high as they did, and why the family's response to it was as calculated as it was. Britain in 1936 was a country that had been managing its anxieties about Europe with a combination of diplomatic caution and genuine fear that was not yet being called what it would later be called. Germany had been rearming since 1933. The Rhineland had been remilitarized in March 1936, without any effective response from France or Britain. Italy had invaded Abyssinia. The Spanish Civil War had begun in July and was already attracting the attention of the major powers in ways that suggested it would not remain contained. Japan was expanding in East Asia. The British government under Stanley Baldwin was not a government that wanted confrontation. It was a government that was trying to buy time, to manage the pace of German ambition without triggering the war that everyone old enough to remember the last one was desperate to prevent. It was a government that needed stability at home, that needed the domestic political landscape to be settled enough that it could focus on the external dangers without fighting a constitutional crisis simultaneously. The abdication was, from Baldwin's perspective, the worst possible timing. Not because the timing could have been better. There was no good time for a constitutional crisis triggered by a king's insistence on marrying a twice-divorced American. But the particular combination of an unstable European situation and an unstable monarchical situation created a period of national anxiety that the government had every reason to resolve as quickly and cleanly as possible. Baldwin handled it by refusing to let the king have what he wanted, while being scrupulously careful about the dignity of the process. He told Edward plainly that the marriage was impossible. He consulted the Dominion governments and returned with their views, which were unanimous. He resisted the king's request to make a broadcast appealing directly to the public on the constitutional grounds that a king cannot go over his ministers' heads to appeal to the people. He was firm, and he was procedurally correct, and he got what he needed. Edward abdicated within a month of the crisis becoming public. The constitutional damage, though real, was contained to a single reign of 325 days. Queen Mary watched Baldwin's management of the situation with the attention of a woman who had spent 60 years learning to read the political dimensions of institutional events. She did not like Baldwin particularly, in the way that women of her generation and background often did not quite like professional politicians, who were a different class of creature from the aristocratic statesmen they remembered from earlier decades. But she appreciated competence, and Baldwin's management of the abdication was competent in the most important sense. It produced the outcome that the institution required. She had her own management task to perform, which was the family dimension of what Baldwin was handling as a political matter. She had to remain visible and composed and royal, because any sign of family collapse during the crisis would compound the institutional damage. She had to give the appearance of a family that was sad but stable, grieving but organized, managing the worst thing that had happened to them in living memory, with the particular upper-class English stoicism that is not quite as natural as it looks. She managed it. She always managed it. The management was one of the things people observed about her, and either admired or found inhumanly cold, depending on whether they thought a person in her situation was entitled to be seen to struggle. She was not entitled to struggle, in her own accounting. She was entitled to feel whatever she felt, privately. She was required to appear composed, because the institution's credibility depended in part on the people who carried it appearing equal to whatever it asked of them. She had spent 60 years practicing. She was very practiced. The life the Windsors built in France across the decades of their exile was more complicated than either the romantic version, which presents it as a great love story sustained in European splendor, or the punitive version, which presents it as the deserved consequence of a catastrophic choice. They were wealthy by any ordinary measure. The Duke had negotiated financial arrangements with his brother that left them comfortable, even as the details of those arrangements produced ongoing bitterness on both sides. They rented a house in Versailles initially, and later acquired Villa Windsor in the Bois de Boulogne on the outskirts of Paris, a substantial property that Wallis transformed, over years of work and considerable expense, into one of the most admired private interiors in European social circles. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. The management of a beautiful and comfortable household was something she approached with the seriousness that other people bring to professional achievement, because it was, in the circumstances of her life, one of the primary ways in which she could demonstrate value. She had no official role. She had no title that opened institutional doors. She had, instead, the ability to make a house that people wanted to be invited to, and she exercised that ability with consistent discipline. The Windsors' dinner parties were famous for being well-run and genuinely enjoyable, which in social circles where dinner parties are usually only one of those things is no small achievement. The food was good, the wine was good, the conversation was encouraged. The guest lists were diverse enough to be interesting, without being so random as to be chaotic. Wallis managed the seating arrangements with the precision of someone who had been observing the way seating arrangements shaped conversations since childhood, which she had. Edward, for his part, was present at these occasions in the way he had been present at events his entire life. Charming, engaged, entertaining for as long as the evening sustained itself, and then tired and sometimes irritable when it ended. He did not have a job. He had not had a job since December 1936. The absence of purpose, for a man who had spent 25 years preparing for and then occupying the most demanding job in the country, was something that left a mark on him that all the dinner parties and all the European travel and all the social success could not fully compensate for. He wrote his memoirs, published in 1951 as A King's Story, which told the narrative of his life from his perspective. The book is readable and self-serving in approximately equal measure, which is not unusual for royal memoirs. It presented Wallis as the woman he had loved and chosen freely and never regretted choosing, which was the argument he had been making since 1936, and which he was still making in 1951, with a consistency that might have been romantic conviction, or might have been the inability to acknowledge that the choice had cost more than he had expected. It sold well. It was translated into multiple languages. It was serialized in newspapers. It gave the Windsor narrative a fixed form that circulated widely: the love story, the tragedy of the man who gave up too much for one woman, or the clarity of the man who finally chose himself over the institution. Queen Mary, who was still alive when the memoirs were published, read them or heard about them in sufficient detail to respond. She said to the Countess of Airlie that the book contained things she had never known and things she had always known and things she could not quite believe anyone had chosen to publish. She did not specify which was which suggests she had not lost her instinct for the carefully managed response. The memoirs did not change her view. Nothing was going to change her view. She was 83 years old, and she had been forming this view for 15 years, and it was part of the structure of who she had become in those years. You do not dismantle the structures of a person's late life with a well-written book. Queen Mary had a historian's appreciation for precedent, partly because she had genuinely studied the history she had been born into, and partly because she understood that institutions survive by making consistent decisions and then pointing to those decisions as the evidence that they have always made consistent decisions. She knew what had happened to monarchies that had allowed personal desire to override institutional requirement. She knew what had happened to the Stuart kings, who had confused divine right with personal preference, and had ended their dynasty in exile and execution, and the eventual elimination of their line from the succession. She knew what had happened to the European royal houses that had not managed the pressures of the 20th century with sufficient discipline. She had watched them fall across the period between 1914 and 1936, and she had drawn from their falling the conclusion that discipline was not optional. The British monarchy had survived where others had not, and Queen Mary's understanding of why it had survived included the specific argument that it had survived by making decisions that were institutionally correct, even when they were personally painful. George V had given up his German relatives' titles during the First World War. He had changed the family name. He had refused to offer asylum to the Tsar and his family in 1917, a decision that still generates historical debate, but that George V apparently made on the basis that the monarchy's survival in a democratic Britain required not being visibly associated with an autocrat under revolutionary pressure. These decisions had costs, real human costs. The decision about the Tsar, in particular, haunted George V for the rest of his life, and he reportedly did not speak of it willingly. But they were decisions made in the framework of institutional survival, and the institution had survived. The abdication presented the same kind of question. What does institutional survival require? And Queen Mary's answer was that it required making very clear, from the beginning and without exception, that the abdication had consequences, that the choice to leave had costs, and that the costs would not be diminished by the passage of time or the persistence of pressing. She was concerned about precedent in a specific way. If the family received Wallis, even once, even in a context of clear reluctance and limited warmth, the message would have been available to be read as, "The institution will eventually accommodate whatever it initially refuses. It will eventually make room. If you wait long enough and press hard enough, the door will open." That message, once available, would be cited by every future member of the family who found themselves in a position of wanting accommodation that the institution did not want to give. She was thinking, without knowing she was thinking about them, about future cases, about the divorces and the relationships and the choices that later members of the family would make and that the institution would have to respond to. Every accommodation sets a standard. Every refusal sets a different standard. Queen Mary was in the business of setting standards, because standards were the thing the institution ran on. She held the line partly for 1936, and partly for what would come after 1936. She could not have known, in detail, what would come after. She knew from experience that something always comes after. She was right about that. The contemporary verdict on Wallis Simpson, read across the private diaries and letters of the people who knew her, or knew the situation well, is considerably more complex than either the official palace narrative or the romantic legend allows. Harold Nicholson, who was thoughtful and generally fair in his assessments, wrote in his diary in early 1936 that he had met Mrs. Simpson and found her intelligent and rather hard. He did not use hard as a compliment, but he did not use it as a condemnation either. He was describing something he had observed, a quality of definiteness, of self-possession, of not being easily moved by other people's opinions, that read to him as a kind of armor. Cecil Beaton, who photographed her across decades and who admired her style extravagantly, made the remark about being a marshmallow made on a welding machine, which became one of the more quoted descriptions of her. The phrase tries to reconcile two qualities that coexisted in her, the social softness, the ease and warmth of a good hostess, and the structural hardness beneath it, the thing that had allowed her to survive 2 difficult marriages and a decade of managing proximity to power without losing her head or her footing. Duff Cooper, who was a cabinet minister during the abdication crisis and who wrote about it in his diaries, observed that he thought Wallis was being blamed for a situation she had not designed and could not have engineered alone, that the king's decision was the king's decision, and attributing it entirely to her influence was both unfair and a convenient way of avoiding the more uncomfortable analysis of what the king himself had done. Cooper's view was not the majority view in the palace. The majority view in the palace, shaped partly by genuine conviction and partly by the institutional need to identify a cause that could be contained and rejected, was that Wallis had been the active agent, that she had maneuvered herself into an unsurvivable position, and that the king's weakness was her opportunity. Queen Mary's adventurous was the palace's word for this theory. But the contemporaries who knew the situation more closely, who had access to correspondence and to the confidences of the people directly involved, were less unanimous. Some thought she had been trying to maintain an arrangement that served her socially without pushing it toward marriage. Some thought she had been frightened by the direction the attachment was taking from at least 1935 onward. Some thought she was precisely what Queen Mary said she was. The truth is probably that she was none of these entirely. She had moved through the world by attaching herself to men whose company she enjoyed and whose social position she found useful, which is a strategy available to women with her particular combination of qualities and which she had pursued without apology since young adulthood. Whether she had expected or intended or even wanted the King of England to give up his throne for her is a question she answered, in various interviews over the years, in ways that were careful enough to leave the question essentially open. She said once, in an interview in the early 1960s, that she would never be a royal highness because never was the answer to that question, and she had made her peace with it. Whether the peace was genuine or performed, only she knew. Those who saw Queen Mary in the final decade of her life, between her mid-70s and her death at 85, consistently reported the same impression, that she seemed to have resolved herself into a fixed form, that the woman was indistinguishable from the queenliness, and that the queenliness was indistinguishable from the position she had built over 60 years of continuous practice. She still wore toque hats that had been fashionable in the Edwardian era, and that by the 1940s and 1950s looked like an architectural feature rather than a fashion choice. She still wore jewels at all times that a person of lesser resolution would have left in a box. She still walked with the posture of a woman who had been told since girlhood that posture was the outward evidence of inner resolution, and who had so thoroughly internalized the message that it was no longer something she maintained by effort, but simply something she was. She was also, by all accounts, genuinely intimidating to a degree that went beyond the usual aura of a person with significant institutional authority. Younger royals, including Princess Elizabeth, who would become Elizabeth II, are recorded as finding their grandmother admirable and somewhat terrifying in equal measure. The admiration was for her endurance and her clarity of purpose. The terror was for the quality of attention she paid to everything around her, the sense that she was permanently evaluating what she observed, and that her evaluations were not inclined toward charity when charity was not deserved. She had opinions about behavior. She had opinions about dress, about decor, about the proper conduct of royal occasions. She had opinions about the correct number of times a piece of jewelry should be worn before it was rested. She had opinions about the arrangement of furniture in rooms, about the management of correspondence, about the timing of meals and the behavior of household staff, and the proper way to acknowledge a person of lesser rank without giving them more acknowledgement than their rank required. These opinions were not delivered as opinions, they were delivered as observations that contained, within their careful phrasing, an implicit judgment that the person addressed was expected to absorb and act upon. She did not need to say, "That is wrong." She said, "I notice that," in a way that meant the same thing. The famous story about her visiting houses and admiring objects was real and was understood by the people it happened to as a transaction that had no graceful exit. You could not tell Queen Mary that you would think about it. The thinking was done before she had finished the sentence. If she admired something in your house and you liked her and you were operating within the social world she inhabited and you wanted to remain within that world in good standing, you gave her the thing she had admired. She understood this perfectly well. She was not an innocent who did not know what she was doing. She was a woman who had organized her relationship with beautiful objects into a system, and the system operated through the specific social dynamics of her world, with the efficiency of something that had been carefully designed, even if it had been designed unconsciously and incrementally over decades of refinement. The point of this, in the context of the Windsor story, is that she applied the same quality of attention to the Wallis question that she applied to everything else. She had organized her position. The position operated with the same efficiency as the collecting habit. It did not require public announcement or explicit enforcement. It simply was, in the same way that Queen Mary's interest in your antique cabinet simply was, and people who understood the system understood what it required of them. The people who needed to not receive Wallis Simpson did not receive her. The people who needed to not invite her to official occasions did not invite her. The people who needed to ensure she was not in the same room as the working royal family at official events ensured it. None of this was formally orchestrated or required written memos. It operated through the same network of understood obligation and unspoken expectation that managed everything else in Queen Mary's world. One dimension of Queen Mary's objection that has sometimes been underemphasized in the romantic telling of the abdication story is the theological one, which in 1936 was as significant as the social one, and in some ways more clearly articulated. The King of England was the supreme governor of the Church of England. This was not an honorific. It was a constitutional position with specific content. The Church did not, in 1936, recognize divorce. Its position on remarriage after divorce, specifically the remarriage of people whose previous spouses were still living, was that such remarriage was not sanctioned and could not be blessed by the Church. Wallis Simpson had been married twice. Both of her previous husbands, Earl Spencer and Ernest Simpson, were alive in 1936. Under the Church's own teaching and under its canonical law as it stood at that time, she could not be remarried in a Church of England ceremony. Her previous marriages remained valid in the eyes of the institution that the King of England was supposed to lead. This created a contradiction that no amount of personal feeling could resolve. If the king married Wallis in a civil ceremony, he would be conducting his personal life in a way that his institutional role explicitly prohibited his subjects from blessing. If he married her in a church ceremony, he would require a clergyman willing to conduct a service that the church as an institution did not sanction, which would require either finding a maverick clergyman or forcing the institutional church to perform a ceremony against its own doctrine. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Lang, was explicit about this. He told Baldwin that the church could not accept the marriage. He told his diary that he found the situation unprecedented and deeply troubling. He was not a man who found most things deeply troubling, which is a measure of how seriously the theological dimension was being taken by the people who had to think about it institutionally. Queen Mary was a regular churchgoer in the Anglican tradition of her generation, not ostentatiously religious, not given to public expression of faith, but genuinely observant in the daily and weekly rhythms of private devotion that characterized her class and background. She understood what the Church's position meant in terms of the specific nature of the obstacle. The king could not marry a woman who was, in the Church's understanding, still married to another man. Whether she found this argument compelling on strictly theological grounds, as opposed to finding it useful as an additional argument on top of the social and constitutional ones, is a question that her letters do not definitively answer. She was not a theological philosopher. She was a woman for whom the established church was part of the structure of the world she knew and depended on, and any action that placed the king in direct conflict with that structure was an action she could not support, regardless of the specific source of the conflict. Edward, who was not notably pious and who does not appear to have found the theological dimension of the objection particularly compelling, was perhaps the least equipped of anyone in the situation to engage with it. He had been told that the church did not approve. He had heard the argument. He did not experience it as determinative, which is the particular kind of religious non-engagement that produces precisely the kind of constitutional crisis it produced. Fort Belvedere, the Georgian house in Windsor Great Park that George V had given Edward in 1930, and that Edward had spent years making into the private world he preferred to any of the official ones, was where the crisis concentrated itself in the first 10 days of December 1936. The house was Edward's. He had renovated it. He had planted its gardens. He had filled it with his preferences, modern comfort alongside genuine antiques, a swimming pool, a steam bath, the particular combination of the informal and the luxurious that he had always found more congenial than the official splendor of Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle. He had entertained there and relaxed there, and it was, in the most functional sense of the word, his home, in a way that none of his official residences had been his home. Wallis had been there constantly in the years leading up to the abdication, and Fort Belvedere bore the marks of her taste alongside his. She had understood the house as a domestic project, and had brought to it the same meticulous attention she brought to every domestic project. The guest rooms were comfortable, the food was considered, the atmosphere was managed. In the first 10 days of December 1936, the house was the site of something that felt from the inside like a siege. Cabinet ministers arrived and departed. The Prime Minister came, brothers came, lawyers came, secretaries and officials and ecclesiastical advisers, and people whose specific role in the constitutional structure was to ensure that the mechanics of what was happening were handled correctly, came and came again. Wallis was not there for most of it. She had left for France on December 3rd, having been persuaded by Lord Brownlow, one of Edward's household officials, that her presence was not helping, and that her absence might give him room to reconsider. She called him from the Villa Louviers in Cannes. They shouted over bad telephone connections. She told him not to abdicate. He told her he was going to abdicate. She issued a statement saying she was willing to withdraw from the situation. He said the statement did not change anything. Edward signed the instrument of abdication on December 10, 1936, in the sitting room at Fort Belvedere, with his brothers watching. The document stated that he declared his irrevocable determination to renounce the throne for himself and his descendants. He signed it in his own hand. He was the former king before the ink was dry. He called Queen Mary to tell her it was done. The call was brief. She received the information without visible collapse, by the accounts that survive. She thanked him for calling. She did not tell him she was glad. She did not tell him she was sorry. She told him she would see him soon. She saw him that evening, at Royal Lodge, for the family dinner that was the farewell occasion. He kissed her hand when it was over, and left, and she went back to Marlborough House, and what the accounts describe as a very long night. The house at Fort Belvedere was never officially his after that. It passed back into Crown management. He did not return to it. Wallis never stayed there again. The swimming pool was eventually filled in. The gardens remained. The house still stands, privately occupied, in the corner of Windsor Great Park, where a man who had been king for 325 days once planted rose bushes with his own hands and called it home. Edward had one demand that he pressed from the moment the abdication was final, and pressed for the rest of his life. He wanted Wallis to be styled Her Royal Highness. He wanted the world to understand that the woman he had given up a throne for was a royal duchess in the full sense, not a woman who held a title without the status that title implied. This was not, on its face, an unreasonable position. Under ordinary circumstances, a wife takes her husband's precedence. The Duke of Windsor held the style of Royal Highness. His wife should have held it too. British common law, as applied to peerage, generally agreed with him. The palace did not apply British common law in the ordinary way. The palace, in this case the new King George VI, his wife, and their advisers, saw the question differently. They saw the granting of Her Royal Highness to Wallis Simpson as an acknowledgement that she was a suitable person to be considered royal, and they were not prepared to make that acknowledgement. George VI wrote to Edward explaining his position. He said he had consulted the heads of the Dominion governments, and that they had advised him that Edward had lost all royal rank upon abdication. He was then, by George VI's choice, restoring that rank, recreating him as His Royal Highness, the Prince Edward, Duke of Windsor. But the letters patent that accomplished this explicitly restricted the style of HRH to Edward alone. The document also contained a sentence that is, by any reading, a statement of institutional contempt. I and my family, and Queen Mary, all feel that it would be a great mistake to acknowledge Mrs. Simpson as a suitable person to become royal. The monarchy has been degraded quite enough already. That sentence was written by King George VI, but the phrase, my family and Queen Mary, makes clear that this was not one person's view. It was the collective position of the Windsor family. Queen Mary was explicitly cited as sharing it. Edward called it a nice wedding present, with the bitterness of a man who knows that the sarcasm is the only response left to him. He complained about it for the rest of his life. He raised it with George VI. He raised it with Elizabeth II, years later, in a conversation at Villa Windsor in Paris, in May 1972, when he was dying, and she had come to pay her respects. His former nurse Julie Alexander said later that securing the title for Wallis was one of the things on Edward's mind in those final weeks, and that the Queen did not grant the request. The denial of HRH was not simply a procedural decision about letters patent and titles of address. It was a statement. It drew a line between the Windsor family and the woman Edward had chosen. It kept Wallis in a permanent social position that required bowing to any female member of the family who held the Royal Highness designation, including women who were junior to her husband by any genealogical calculation. When members of the royal family were in the same room as the Windsors, Wallis curtsied to them. They did not curtsy to her. Edward found this humiliating enough that he required his own household to accord Wallis the full courtesy title in private. Staff addressed her as Your Royal Highness in the Windsor households in France. But outside those households, the royal family's position held. She was the Duchess of Windsor, and that was all. Queen Mary's position on this was consistent and never varied. She had called Wallis an adventuress before the abdication. She saw no reason to revise the assessment afterward. The title question reinforced her view. An adventuress who had captured a king should not be rewarded with the style she had pursued. To grant it would be to say that the pursuit had been legitimate, and Queen Mary did not believe the pursuit had been legitimate. The fact that Wallis herself later wrote that the distinction did not seem particularly important to her, that she would rather have had Edward keep the greater title he had given up than quibble over a lesser one, does not change what the denial meant to the family, or why they made it. Wallis's stated indifference might even have been genuine. She had come a long way from the small resort town in Pennsylvania. A duchess of any kind was more than Bessie Wallis Warfield had been born expecting to become. But Edward cared, and the family knew he cared, and the denial continued because on some level it was meant to go on hurting, not as personal cruelty exactly, but as a sustained reminder that the decision had consequences, and that the consequences would not be softened by the passage of time. Queen Mary would live until 1953. She would not soften. In October 1937, 16 months after the abdication, and 4 months after their wedding, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor travelled to Germany. They toured industrial plants and met with various Nazi officials. On October 22nd, they had lunch with Adolf Hitler at his mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden. The photographs from that meeting have been reproduced thousands of times in the decades since. Edward stands in the receiving line. He shakes Hitler's hand. Wallis stands to one side. Everyone smiles with the practiced ease of people who have spent their lives smiling at important people in formal settings. The palace regarded this visit with horror, though a horror that was carefully contained in private. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, had actually given the Windsors a degree of official sanction for the German trip, framing it as a study of labor conditions, but the visit to Hitler was widely understood to be a catastrophic misjudgment at best, and something worse at worst. Queen Mary's feelings about Germany had always been complicated by the fact that she was half German herself, the daughter of Francis of Teck, and that many of her closest cousins were German by birth and upbringing. She had watched those connections become liabilities during the First World War, when the family changed its name from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor, and when her son George V required his relatives to relinquish their German titles. She had made those adjustments without public complaint, because the institution required it. But visiting Hitler was not a complicated adjustment. It was, in the view of everyone in the palace, including George VI and Queen Mary, a direct stain on whatever dignity the former king still carried. It gave the Nazi regime a propaganda victory. It suggested that the man who had just abdicated the British throne was at least sympathetic to, and possibly genuinely admiring of, the dictatorship that was rearming Germany and making Europe increasingly afraid. Queen Mary did not write to Edward about the visit, in terms that have survived in any accessible record, but the people around her were clear on her view, and the visit deepened the palace's existing decision to keep the Windsors at a distance. They were not brought back to Britain. They were not given official roles. They were not invited to any formal occasion that would have put them in proximity to the working royal family. When the Second World War began in September 1939, the question of what to do with the former king became simultaneously urgent and embarrassing. He was a man with royal status, considerable fame, and a demonstrated willingness to meet with the enemy. Letting him drift around occupied Europe was dangerous. Keeping him in Britain was politically complicated, partly because he would inevitably be used by opponents of the war as a symbol of alternative policy, and partly because George VI and the palace did not trust him. He was eventually made governor of the Bahamas in August 1940, a role that removed him from Europe without looking like exile, though it was exile. The Bahamas were considered the most remote and least prestigious posting available to a man of his former rank, which was understood on all sides to be precisely the point. Wallis hated the Bahamas. She found the colony limiting, the climate oppressive, and the social life constrained compared to the world she had been moving through in France and England. She applied herself to the role of governor's wife with considerable energy, because she had always applied herself to whatever situation she was in with whatever energy she had. But she wrote letters back to friends in Europe that made clear she viewed the posting as punishment. She was not entirely wrong about that. From Britain, Queen Mary watched the Windsors in the Bahamas with the combination of relief and disapproval that characterized most of her feelings about the Duke in those years. He was away, which was safer. He was still causing problems, which was irritating. He was still pressing the HRH question, still complaining about money, still writing letters that required diplomatic management. She sent him birthday gifts every year. She continued to correspond. The relationship did not end. It continued in the particular exhausting way of relationships between people who are committed to each other through blood and history, but who cannot, in any current circumstance, actually help each other. He visited London in October 1945, the first time he had been back since the abdication. He stayed for 3 weeks. He did not bring Wallis. Queen Mary received him at Marlborough House. She had not seen him in nearly 9 years. Whatever that meeting was like, whatever passed between a mother of 88 and the son she had not seen since he abdicated and married the woman she would not receive, it was conducted privately, and no detailed account of it survived in any document that has been made public. We know the meeting happened. We know it was the first in 9 years. We know that Wallis was not present. Whether Queen Mary specifically required Wallis's absence as a condition of the meeting, or whether the question was simply understood by all parties without needing to be stated, the outcome was the same. The son came. The wife stayed behind. The pattern that had been established in December 1936 continued without adjustment. From 1945 until Queen Mary's death in March 1953, the Windsors and the British royal family maintained a relationship that can be described only as managed estrangement. Edward wanted to come home. He wanted a role. He wanted recognition. He wanted, in the plainest possible terms, for what he had done to be forgiven, and for the life he had chosen to be accepted as a legitimate choice rather than a failure that required ongoing punishment. He was never going to get what he wanted from Queen Mary. The family's general position, orchestrated largely by Queen Elizabeth, who had become Queen Consort in December 1936, and who hated Wallis with a directness that even the most discreet accounts cannot entirely obscure, was that the Windsors could visit Britain as private individuals. They would not be given official roles. They would not be given official residences. Wallis would not be received by the family, and the HRH question was not going to be revisited. Edward pressed anyway. He pressed with letters and with intermediaries, and with visits, during which he raised the subject again, and was again told no. He did this in a way that suggested he believed persistence would eventually produce a different answer, which suggests he never entirely understood the people he was dealing with. Queen Mary was asked, at some point in the late 1940s, whether Edward would be permitted to return to Britain permanently. Her answer was reported by contemporaries as having been, "Not until he comes to my funeral." There is something both cold and piercing about this response. It contains the acknowledgement that he was allowed, of course, to come to his own mother's funeral. She was not going to exclude him from that. But it makes the funeral the only occasion she is willing to name as appropriate for his return. Her death, not a change of heart. Her death as the condition. She may have also meant something more literal, that she expected him to come to her funeral precisely because she knew she would die before any reconciliation occurred, and that the funeral would therefore be the occasion on which the absence finally ended. not because anyone had softened, but because the absence could no longer be maintained with her body in the room. The politics of royal visits and royal exclusions in this period were dense and unpleasant. The Windsors lived primarily in France, in a house outside Paris that they rented and eventually purchased, and that Wallis furnished with a care and expense that became one of the points of contention in any discussion of their finances. They entertained, they travelled, they moved through the society of wealthy expatriates, American socialites, international celebrities, and the kind of idle rich who fill the social calendars of people in comfortable exile. Edward found it meaningless. He had spent 25 years as the heir apparent, then almost a year as king, and then the next several decades without a job that mattered. He reviewed his memories constantly. He wrote his memoirs. He gave interviews in which he explained himself, which is never a particularly convincing thing for a man in his situation to do, because an explanation that needs to be repeated is usually an explanation that is not being accepted. He also, in private and in writing, continued to insist that Wallis had not wanted him to abdicate, that she had tried to withdraw from the situation, had offered to leave, had drafted a statement for public release saying she was willing to step away if it would resolve the crisis. This is true, as far as it goes. Wallis did issue such a statement in December 1936. Edward did not accept it. He would not accept it. He abdicated anyway, over her stated objections, and then spent the next 35 years of their marriage insisting that she had been worth it. Wallis, for her part, played the role of the woman who had been worth it with a consistency that must have required considerable discipline. She organized their households, she managed their social life, she wore the jewels he gave her, which were extraordinary by any standard, with the composure of someone who understood that the jewels were part of the argument he was making, and that making the argument required her cooperation. She gave interviews in which she said the right things. She was charming to the right people. Whether she loved him in the way he loved her is one of those questions that people who observe complicated marriages from the outside should approach with significant caution. What can be said is that she was with him until he died, in May 1972, and that she organized his death with the same efficiency she had organized his life, and that she spent the 14 years between his death and her own in a condition that the people around her described as diminished and increasingly remote. Queen Mary did not live to see any of this. She died on March 24, 1953, 11 weeks before Elizabeth II's coronation, which she had been determined to witness and which she did not survive to see. In the weeks before her death, her condition had been declining, and she had made clear to the people around her that if her death appeared imminent before the coronation, she did not want the coronation postponed on her account. She had organized the management of her own dying around the institutional requirements of her granddaughter's accession. She was still, at 85, putting the country before everything else. Edward came to London for the funeral. He came without Wallis. Queen Elizabeth, by then the Queen Mother, attended. The new Queen Elizabeth II attended. The family gathered at Marlborough House and then proceeded to Windsor, where Queen Mary was buried alongside her husband in St. George's Chapel. The woman who had refused to receive Wallis Simpson for 17 years was in the ground. The Duchess of Windsor, somewhere in France, was not at the funeral. The most reliable evidence of Queen Mary's feelings about the Duchess of Windsor comes not from official statements, which were inevitably managed, but from what she said to people she trusted in private moments that happened to be recorded. The conversation with Lady Airlie about the jewels is one example. "I am so afraid that he may ask me to receive her," is a sentence that reveals an understanding of what reception would cost. Not social comfort, but institutional integrity. She was not afraid in the way that suggests personal anxiety. She was afraid in the way that a person is afraid of being put in a position where doing the right thing requires saying something that will cause pain to someone they love. Her refusal when the question was actually put to her, because she is an adventuress, is 4 words that packed a complete worldview. She was not reaching for vague disapproval. She was making a precise accusation about the nature of the relationship and the nature of the woman involved. She told Mabel Ogilvy, the Countess of Airlie, who was one of the handful of people Queen Mary genuinely trusted, that the abdication had broken her. Lady Airlie reported this later. The word is striking because it is so unlike the vocabulary Queen Mary normally used in discussing herself. She did not break things, she maintained things. She kept things ordered. To say she had been broken was to acknowledge something she would not have acknowledged in any public statement. Henry Channon, the diarist, wrote in December 1936 that Queen Mary and the court hate Wallis Simpson to the point of hysteria. He followed this with the observation that they were taking up the wrong attitude and were better advised to be civil, if beyond their courage to be cordial. Channon was a sympathizer of the Windsors, so his framing is not neutral, but his observation of the intensity is useful. He was describing something he had observed in conversations, and at dinners, and in the climate of courtly opinion as he moved through it, and what he was observing was a genuine and consistent hostility that did not require much provocation to surface. Channon's suggestion that the hostility was excessive, that it would have been better policy to accept the situation and move on, reflects a kind of pragmatic worldliness that Queen Mary simply did not possess. Queen Mary did not make decisions on the basis of whether they were the pragmatically clever thing to do. She made them on the basis of what the institution required and what the principles she had lived by demanded. Being civil to Wallis Simpson would have required accepting, at least implicitly, that what had happened could be accommodated within the family's self-understanding. She was not prepared to do that, and no amount of pragmatic argument was going to change her. James Pope Hennessy, who was given access to Queen Mary in her final years for the purpose of writing her biography, found a woman who was intensely private about her genuine feelings, but whose opinions about the abdication remained as sharp as they had been in 1936. He described her as having a kind of organized coldness when the subject arose, not volatility, but a very deliberate turning away from the topic, as if she had decided that the thing could not be changed and therefore must not be examined too often. She had not forgiven Edward, in the specific sense of coming to believe that what he had done was understandable or defensible. She continued to love him, in the sense that she sent birthday gifts and maintained a correspondence, and did not refuse to see him when he came. But forgiveness, in her understanding, would have required agreeing that his choice was valid. She never agreed. She told him so in her letter. She said it in more restrained ways on other occasions. She carried it with her until the end. The Duchess of Windsor, throughout all of this, received none of this directly. She and Queen Mary were never in the same room. They never exchanged letters. They never spoke by telephone. The 17 years between the abdication and Queen Mary's death proceeded without a single documented interaction between them. This is the war that has no record of its battles, because the battles were conducted entirely through absence. Every occasion from which Wallis was excluded, every family gathering she was not invited to, every visit to Britain that Edward made alone, every social season that the Windsors spent in France while the royal family spent it in London or Scotland or Windsor, every coronation and every state occasion and every Christmas from 1936 to 1953, all of it was the war. All of it was the message, maintained without variation and without explanation, that some choices have permanent consequences, and the person who made a certain choice in December 1936 had been informed of one of them. If you're finding this story as gripping as we do, now is a great time to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We'll be continuing right now, but if you want to be notified when our next story goes up, hit that bell. It takes 2 seconds, and it helps us keep making these. Now, back to the story. People who knew Queen Mary in the years after the abdication sometimes ask the question that observers have been asking ever since. Why did it last so long? The crisis was over. Edward was gone. The new king was managing. The country had survived. Why sustain the hostility toward Wallis for 17 years, with no visible softening? The answers are several, and they stack on each other in ways that help explain why the whole structure was so durable. The first reason is the simplest and should not be minimized. Queen Mary had loved her eldest son with a complexity and an intensity that her style of emotional expression did not easily accommodate. She had invested in him differently than she had invested in her other children, and the investment had collapsed. The person she had been most afraid would destroy the monarchy had destroyed a version of it that she could not rebuild, even after George VI rebuilt the crown's public standing, and Elizabeth II consolidated what he had done. What she had lost was not recoverable, because what she had lost was her belief that the institution she had spent her entire life protecting was proof against the specific failure it had just suffered. She had believed, on some level, that what she modeled would be absorbed, that if you showed a child, from birth, what duty required, the child would understand it when the test arrived. David had understood it. He had simply decided that understanding was not the same as accepting. He had walked away from the lesson she had spent 30 years teaching him, and he had done it for a woman she considered unworthy of the sacrifice. That is not just political disagreement. That is the personal failure of a pedagogy she had staked her most important relationship on. The second reason involves the specific quality of what Wallis represented to Queen Mary's sense of order. An American twice-divorced socialite was not, by any standard available in 1936, a suitable consort for the King of England. This was not snobbery in the simple social sense, though social position was certainly part of the calculation. It was constitutional. The King was head of the Church of England, and the Church of England did not then recognize divorce. A king who married a twice-divorced woman whose previous two husbands were still alive was placing himself in direct contradiction with the religious authority he was supposed to embody. Queen Mary was genuinely religious, in the restrained Anglican fashion of her generation, and she understood the theological problem alongside the social and constitutional ones. But she also understood, and this is the part that mattered most to her, that the monarchy's moral credibility rested on the monarch being seen to hold himself to the same standards he was asking his subjects to honor. A king who said that marriage was a sacrament could not simultaneously take a third wife. The hypocrisy was not just embarrassing, it was load-bearing. Remove it, and part of the structure fell. The third reason is more personal, and in some ways the most painful. The abdication forced George VI, a man who had never been meant to be king, into a job that would shorten his life. George VI died in February 1952, at the age of 56, of lung cancer. His health had been deteriorating since the war years, and the extraordinary strain of the war years had been placed on him because his older brother had walked away from the burden. Queen Mary lived to see her younger son die. She had already watched her husband die, in part exhausted by the long reign that had carried him through 4 decades of increasingly heavy responsibility. She now watched George VI die, having lived the same exhaustion in a compressed and more acute form. She watched him cough through public events. She watched him grow thin and tired. She watched him make his final radio broadcast in November 1951. The words, slow and effortful. The voice of a man fighting his own body to get through the sentences. And she knew, in the way that mothers of families know things they have not been told directly, that the burden George VI carried was a burden David had refused. David had refused it for Wallis. The chain from the abdication to the lung cancer ward was not direct and was not simple, and there were many other factors involved. But you could draw a line between those 2 points, and Queen Mary, standing in her 80s with her second son in the ground, could see that line clearly. How much of her treatment of Wallis was grief redirected into hostility is impossible to say with certainty. Grief often needs somewhere to go when it cannot go where it belongs, and it cannot always go where it belongs because the person it belongs to is beyond reach, or has done something that makes straight grief impossible. Queen Mary grieved for Edward, who was alive but lost. She grieved for the institution he had wounded. She grieved for George VI, who had carried what Edward left behind. She grieved for the 17 years she had spent in the cold knowledge that the thing she had given her life to was more fragile than it appeared. Wallis was the name she could attach to all of it. Wallis had not caused all of it, but Wallis was the available label, the fixed point around which all the other griefs could organize themselves. That woman. 2 words that contained 17 years of loss. The fourth reason is the most structural and in some ways the most interesting. Queen Mary's refusal to receive Wallis was not just personal, it was policy. It set a precedent within the family that Elizabeth II and the Queen Mother maintained after Queen Mary's death. The message was consistent. The monarchy had a standard, and the woman who had been the occasion of the standard's most public failure was not going to be admitted into the family's formal circle. The door that had been closed in 1936 was going to stay closed. This mattered because the alternative was worse. If the family had received Wallis, even once, even briefly, even in a context of cold politeness rather than warmth, the message would have been that the abdication was ultimately forgivable, that the consequences were temporary, that persistence would eventually wear down even the stiffest resistance. That message would have been useful to the Windsors in some ways. It would have been catastrophic for the institution that had just spent 17 years rebuilding its authority on the foundation of the lesson the abdication was supposed to have taught. The lesson was, the crown is not negotiable. The crown does not yield to personal desire. The crown exists before any individual who carries it, and will exist after them. These are things the institution believed and needed the public to believe, and the public's belief depended in part on the institution behaving as if it believed them. Receiving Wallis would have said, "We don't quite believe them after all." It would have said, "We will eventually make room for you if you wait long enough and press hard enough." And it would have said that to every future member of the family who might one day want to press hard enough for something the institution did not want to accommodate. Queen Mary understood this. It is not that she was incapable of flexibility or that she never made accommodations to changed circumstances. She was not a mechanical creature operating on fixed programming, but this was the accommodation she would not make, because it was the accommodation that would cost the most. She held the line. She held it until she died, and after she died, the line held without her. No account of Queen Mary's hatred for Wallis Simpson is complete without acknowledging that she was not alone in that hatred, and that the woman who shared it most completely was not a Tech at all, but a Scottish earl's daughter from Glamis, who had been watching the situation develop since 1936, with the calm professional attention of a woman who understood exactly what was at stake. Queen Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, called Wallis "that woman," with a consistency that matched Queen Mary's. She never modified the phrase. She used it in conversation with staff, with family members, with the people who worked in her households across the decades. "That woman" was the phrase that said everything she needed to say without requiring the kind of explicit statement that could be quoted in newspapers. She had specific reasons for her specific fury, reasons that went beyond the institutional objections Queen Mary had articulated. George VI had sobbed like a child, according to accounts of December 1936, when he understood the burden he was being asked to carry. He was a man with a severe stammer who found public speaking agonizing, who had never expected or wanted the throne, who had been told repeatedly in his youth that his older brother was the capable one, the impressive one, the one who would lead. Elizabeth had married him knowing all of this. She had considered the question carefully enough that she had refused his proposals twice before accepting. She had understood exactly what she was accepting. She had spent the subsequent years building something around him, a marriage and a household and a public partnership that worked precisely because it was built on the understanding that he was the man she had chosen. And then in December 1936, another man's bad decision had made him king. She had not chosen that. She had not chosen to move from Buckingham Palace to Balmoral to Sandringham on the schedule of a working monarch. She had not chosen to be queen consort. She had not chosen to watch her husband age under the weight of a job that was in many ways the wrong job for his particular nervous system. She had not chosen the tuberculosis-adjacent damage to his lungs. She had not chosen his death at 56. She chose, in return, to spend the rest of her life making clear to anyone who would listen or observe that she had not forgiven the pair of them. She lobbied for the denial of HRH. She maintained the social exclusions. When the Windsors visited Britain, she managed her schedule to be elsewhere when possible and made no gesture of welcome when not. She outlived Edward, and then outlived Wallis, and when Wallis's funeral was held at Windsor in April 1986, the Queen Mother, who was 85 and in reasonable health according to the accounts of the time, was reported indisposed by her press secretary. She was photographed that same afternoon at Royal Lodge, approximately 2 miles from Windsor Chapel, being driven in her car in apparently normal health. She had waited until Wallis was dead to be indisposed. She had outlasted her. This shared front between Queen Mary and the Queen Mother is worth noting because it clarifies something about the nature of the hostility. It was not simply one woman's personal reaction to a personal affront. It was an institutional posture, held by two of the most powerful women in the royal family across 5 decades, and it was held deliberately and consistently because they both believed it served the crown's long-term interests. Whether they were right is a question that depends on your view of how institutions should handle the accommodation of individual choice. The monarchy survived the abdication. It was stronger in many respects after George VI and Elizabeth rebuilt it than it had been before. Edward's particular version of glamour, which had been so magnetic in the 1920s and so dangerous in the 1930s, was replaced by something less spectacular and more durable. Two people doing a job they had not wanted, with a steadiness that eventually produced its own form of public affection. Wallis spent the years after Edward's death in 1972 in a condition that multiple witnesses described as isolated and unhappy. She lived in the house outside Paris that had been their home. She saw very few visitors. Her health declined. She became, by the end, a woman who was rarely seen in public and who was described by those who did see her as somewhere far from the room she was in, present in body, but absent in whatever way matters more. She died on April 24, 1986, at 89 years old. She was buried at Frogmore in Windsor, alongside Edward, in the royal burial ground she had been pointedly excluded from visiting during his lifetime in any context that required royal sanction. The woman who had broken a monarchy, or had been used by a man who broke one, was buried in the royal ground. The institution was patient enough to absorb her in the end, though it had taken 50 years and several deaths to get there. In 1937, as the Duke and Duchess of Windsor settled into their French exile, and the London season proceeded without them, Queen Mary said something to the Countess of Airlie that Lady Airlie later recorded. She said that the worst part was not what had happened, but what she feared might yet happen. That Edward, unable to bear the exclusion, would go on making trouble from the outside. That the abdication would not be the end of the crisis, but only its first chapter. She was not entirely wrong about this. The Windsors were a continued source of diplomatic headache throughout the early years of the war. The governor of the Bahamas, who was the Duke of Windsor, proved difficult in his handling of labor unrest on the islands and in his management of a murder case involving a wealthy Canadian businessman that remains controversial to this day. He communicated, through various back channels, with Nazi officials in ways that produced enough material for later historians to write significant books about what exactly he was trying to accomplish. Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, wrote in his diary in 1945 that the Duke of Windsor was a serious security risk. Files from the Nazi era, recovered after the war, suggested that German intelligence had considered various schemes involving the former king, some of them wildly implausible, and some of them less so. Whether Edward was actively a traitor or merely spectacularly naive about his own usefulness to the Nazis is a question that scholars disagree on. What is beyond dispute is that his behavior during the war years, including the German visit of 1937 and the communications that followed, gave the palace, the government, and the intelligence services reasonable grounds for concern. And those concerns were, in their own way, a continuation of the argument Queen Mary had been making since November 1936, that the man who had been king was not constitutionally reliable, that personal loyalty and political loyalty were not the same thing for him, that the Crown's interests and his own interests were not, in the final analysis, aligned. Wallis's role in all of this is genuinely difficult to assess. She appears, from the available evidence, to have had no particular admiration for Nazism beyond the social comfort she felt in the presence of wealthy and powerful people who treated her as an equal, which in the Germany of 1937 included people who were Nazis. Whether she was politically sophisticated enough to understand the implications of those associations is unclear. What is clear is that she did not stop them. Queen Mary, reading what was available to her from her position in Marlborough House and from the reports that made their way through the family's communication channels, was confirming in these years the assessment she had made in 1936. The woman was not suitable. The man had chosen her anyway. The consequences, as she had warned him, were continuing. She was angry. She was also, and this is the part that gets lost in the more dramatic version of the story, deeply sad. She had a son she could not see, living abroad with a woman she would not receive, doing things that embarrassed the family he had been born to lead. She sent him birthday gifts every year. She answered his letters. She maintained the connection because the connection was all she could maintain. She had told him in 1938 that her feelings for him as his mother remained the same. She meant it. She was not lying when she said she loved him. She was also not lying when she said she could not accept what he had done. Those two things are not incompatible, though they are very hard to live with, and Queen Mary lived with them for 17 years. One detail from the years between the abdication and Queen Mary's death that has attracted significant attention from historians involves the jewels. Edward gave Wallis extraordinary quantities of jewellery over the years they were together, and a significant portion of those jewels had been gifts from Queen Mary herself to Edward during his years as Prince of Wales. Queen Mary was particular about jewels. She had a collector's eye, a curator's memory, and an aristocratic understanding that jewelry is history in miniature, that gems and settings carry provenance and meaning that extends beyond their monetary value. She had spent decades building up her own collection, had received pieces from her mother-in-law, Queen Alexandra, had added pieces she encountered in other collections, and had given pieces to her family members with the expectation, never quite articulated, but universally understood, that those pieces remained in some sense hers. When Edward gave Queen Mary's gifts to Wallis, he was transferring something that Queen Mary regarded, probably correctly, as royal property, in a sense that went beyond legal ownership. He was putting the symbols of the dynasty's history around the neck of the woman she had refused to receive. The jewellery Wallis wore after the marriage was spectacular. It was also, in the eyes of Queen Mary and the Queen Mother, a series of small violations. A brooch that had belonged to Queen Alexandra, necklaces that had been commissioned for royal occasions, earrings from the royal collection, all of it now in France, all of it visible in photographs that circulated through society. Queen Mary tracked these pieces the way she tracked everything that had once been in her possession, with the attentiveness of someone who believed that beautiful objects should be where they could be properly cared for and properly accounted for. She could not ask for them back. She did not have grounds for that request, legally or socially, but she knew where they were, and knowing where they were was itself a form of accounting, a running ledger of what the abdication had cost the family in the most material sense. After Edward's death in 1972, the Windsor jewels became the subject of considerable legal and diplomatic activity. The Duchess eventually sold much of the collection at auction in 1987, the year after her own death, in a sale that raised extraordinary sums. Many pieces were identified as having originated in the royal collection. Sotheby's handled the auction. The bidders came from around the world. The family watched from a distance. The sale was, in its own quiet way, the last chapter of the story that had begun in November 1936. Wallis was gone. Edward was gone. Queen Mary was gone. The Queen Mother was still alive, aged 86, and the jewels that had once passed from royal hands to those of the woman she had spent 50 years calling that woman were now passing into the hands of private collectors with money and enthusiasm. Whether the Queen Mother found this satisfying or merely inevitable is one of those questions that nobody who knew her ever quite answered on the record. Time does strange things to the reputations of people who were once subjects of real controversy. Wallis Simpson, who was when she was alive the object of extraordinary hostility across Britain and the Empire, has in the decades since her death been reassessed several times. The first reassessment, which began in the 1980s and extended through the 1990s, tended towards sympathy. Biographers including Anne Seber and Andrew Morton produced detailed accounts of Wallis's life that emphasized her difficult childhood, her complex marriages, the genuine question of whether she had wanted the abdication or had tried to prevent it, and the degree to which the hostility directed at her was shaped by misogyny and xenophobia as much as by legitimate constitutional concern. These assessments are not without merit. Wallis was, by any account, the target of extraordinary vituperation that often strayed into territory that was about her being American, being twice divorced, being a woman who had moved through male-dominated social environments, with conspicuous success. The rumor that she had learned exotic sexual techniques in a Chinese brothel, which circulated through court circles and was actually repeated to Queen Mary as a partial explanation for Edward's attachment, is a measure of how much of the hostility toward her was not really about the constitutional question at all. A later reassessment, drawing on intelligence documents released under archival rules, and on letters and diaries that became accessible after various deaths, has been somewhat less sympathetic. The German connection, the Nazi visit, the various communications with enemy officials during the years of the war, cast a shadow that sympathy about the divorce question cannot entirely explain away. Andrew Morton's later book on the subject, published under the title 17 Carnations, argues that the documentary evidence is substantial enough to warrant serious concern about Edward's wartime loyalties, and by extension, about the environment in which he operated, which included Wallis. Neither reassessment would have interested Queen Mary. She did not require the archival record to tell her what she already believed, and what she believed was settled in the rooms of Marlborough House in November and December 1936. Queen Mary's own reputation has fluctuated similarly. She is remembered variously as a magnificent autocrat, a superb royal consort, a cold mother, an insatiable collector, and a woman of extraordinary self-discipline in the service of an institution that few people today would organize their entire lives around. Her treatment of Wallis is sometimes presented as the darkest mark against her, evidence of a vindictiveness that sat alongside her considerable virtues without quite resolving into a consistent character. The more useful view, probably, is less dramatic. She was a woman who had organized her entire life around a particular set of values, who had sacrificed personal comfort for those values repeatedly across 60 years, and who found in the last chapter of her life that the sacrifice had not protected her from the specific failure she had most feared. She reacted to that failure with the only tools she had. The consistent application of the standards she had always applied extended now to a situation she had not chosen and could not change. She was not trying to punish Wallis for being a bad person, exactly. She was trying to maintain, in the most tangible way available to her, the statement that what had happened was wrong and that the wrongness had consequences. She was the institution's memory, the living record of what the Crown required, and what happened when those requirements were not met. She held that position for 17 years and died holding it. Queen Mary kept letters. She kept them carefully, organized by date and correspondent, in the systematic way of a woman who understood that written correspondence was not merely communication, but evidence. She was also, across her long life, a significant letter writer herself, producing thousands of documents that have since been archived in the Royal Archives at Windsor and in private collections. The letters that touch on the Wallis question and on her feelings about the abdication and its aftermath reveal something more complicated than the simple narrative of institutional cold-heartedness that her public behavior suggests. She was more conflicted than she appeared. There are moments in the correspondence, particularly in letters to the Countess of Airlie, where the control slips slightly and something more raw is visible. She writes, in one letter from the late 1930s, that she has spent her life telling her children that duty comes before everything, and she now finds herself wondering whether she had communicated the message with enough warmth or only with enough rigor. This is not a self-pitying sentence. It is the sentence of a woman reviewing her pedagogical methods in the light of a catastrophic result. She does not conclude that she was wrong about duty. She does not revise the principle, but she asks the question of whether the principle can be taught only as principle or whether it requires something else alongside it that she may not have supplied in sufficient quantity. This is as close as she comes, in any surviving document, to acknowledging that her parenting might have played a role in the outcome she was grieving. The letter she wrote to Edward in 1938 is the most cited document in this part of the story, and rightly so, because it contains the two sentences that capture her position most exactly. The first is the description of his failure to listen, his inability to take in anything, which contains not just her frustration but her genuine bewilderment. She had argued her case. She had made her points. He had been unable to hear them, or had heard them, and had not been moved by them, which amounted to the same thing from her perspective. The second is her own self-description. After all my life I have put my country before everything else, and I simply cannot change now. This is a genuine account of how she understood herself. She was not performing a position for his benefit. She was telling him something that she believed was simply true, in the way that a person who has organized their entire character around a conviction states that conviction, not with passion, but with the flatness of someone for whom the thing is so settled as to require no defense. He never quite accepted this self-description. He thought, from the evidence of his letters and his memoirs, that her position was at least partly about her inability to accept personal emotion into the calculation, that she was using duty as a cover for a coldness that had its own source. He was not wrong that she was cold, in the sense that her emotional life was conducted almost entirely in private. He was wrong, probably, about what the coldness covered. What it covered was not absence of feeling. What it covered was an enormous amount of feeling that she had decided, for reasons that went back to the borrowed rooms of her childhood, could not be expressed in public without undermining everything she had spent her life building. She had learned that public feeling is a vulnerability, and that vulnerability in the person who carries the crown is a danger to the crown. She had applied that lesson so consistently for so long that the appearance and the reality had become difficult to separate. She grieved for David. She never stopped grieving for him. She sent him birthday presents. She answered his letters. She received him when he came to England without Wallis. She maintained the connection in every way that did not require her to receive Wallis or to acknowledge that the abdication had been anything other than what she had always said it was. The form of the connection was constrained, and the form was painful, and she lived with the pain of it for 17 years in the same private interior where all the other feelings that she did not express in public were kept. It was a private room. She died with its contents intact. Queen Mary died in March 1953. The Queen Mother, who shared her view of the Windsors entirely, did not die until 2002. Between those two dates, the sustained refusal to accommodate the Duchess of Windsor was maintained across nearly 5 additional decades, carried forward by a woman who had watched the situation develop from a closer position than Queen Mary, and who had, if anything, more specific reasons for her hostility. Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, had never had any illusion about what the Duchess of Windsor represented. From the moment in December 1936, when she understood that her husband was about to become king against his will and against his nature, she had understood that the woman who had been the occasion of that demand was also the cause of everything that would come after it. The stammering, the strain, the public events that required her husband to do things that cost him physically, the letters that continued to arrive from France, and the telephone calls, and the demands and the complaints, she connected all of it to the abdication, and she connected the abdication to Wallis. Whether this chain of causation is entirely fair is a question that requires more information about what George VI would have been like without the pressure of the throne, which is not information anyone has. He might have been anxious and strained under the weight of any demanding job. He might have had the lung problems from the heavy smoking that was characteristic of his generation regardless of his position. The tuberculosis-adjacent lung disease that killed him at 56 had multiple possible causes. But the Queen Mother did not engage in that kind of careful causal analysis. She understood the situation through a framework of loyalty and blame, in which her husband had been asked to carry something he had not been designed to carry, and had done so until it killed him, and the woman who had set that chain in motion would not receive her forgiveness or her acknowledgement or her courtesy or her presence at a funeral in April 1986. She outlasted everyone in this story except Wallis herself, and she outlasted Wallis by 16 years. She died in 2002 at the age of 101, having maintained her position on the Duchess of Windsor without modification for 66 years from the abdication. Without modification from the moment the question was put to her, and for every year of her life that followed. This is a kind of durability that requires a specific character to achieve. She was not a person who carried grudges in the small, petty way of people who cannot let a slight go. She was a person who made decisions about what mattered, and held to them for as long as she lived, which in her case was long enough that the decisions became part of the institution she was holding. The royal family after the Queen Mother's death has approached questions of divorce and remarriage and the accommodation of personal choice within the institution differently, partly because circumstances have changed, and partly because the human cost of the historical approach had become visible enough that the institution found it difficult to maintain. Charles and Camilla's eventual marriage, and the family's acceptance of it, would have been impossible in 1936, and was made possible partly by the subsequent decades of watching the costs of absolute intransigence. But the specific Wallis case was over by then. The positions had been held for the duration of the people who held them, and when those people died, the positions died with them. Wallis was dead. Edward was dead. Queen Mary was dead. The Queen Mother was dead. What remained was the historical record of what they had all chosen and what it had cost. The abdication is, from any angle of examination, a story about two incompatible understandings of what the person who wears the crown owes to the institution it represents. Edward's understanding was the understanding of a man who had grown up inside the institution and found it constraining to the point of suffocation. He had spent 35 years being told that his job was the only thing about him that mattered, that his personal preferences were irrelevant to the question of how he should behave, that the institution's needs would always and necessarily override his own. He had complied, with varying degrees of grace and occasional visible reluctance, for those 35 years. And then he stopped complying. He stopped because he had found, in Wallis Simpson, something that the institution did not provide and could not provide. A private world that was organized around his needs rather than the institution's requirements. A person who treated him as a man rather than as a position. An intimacy that did not require the permanent subordination of self to role. Whether that was a good enough reason to abdicate is a question that has no single right answer, because the answer depends entirely on what you believe the institution is and what you believe the institution is for. If you believe the monarchy is a job that a particular person does, and that the person's well-being matters as much as the job's requirements, then his choice has a kind of logic to it. If you believe the monarchy is an institution that exists before and after any individual who carries it, and that the institution's survival depends on its members behaving as if the institution matters more than they do, then his choice is an act of institutional vandalism. Queen Mary believed the second thing. She had always believed the second thing. She had organized her entire life around the second thing, and she had paid for her belief with everything the belief required her to surrender. And when her eldest son told her that the second thing was wrong, that the first thing was actually right, she could not engage with the argument on his terms, because engaging with it would have meant reviewing the ledger of her own sacrifices and finding that the accounting did not add up the way she had been telling herself it did. The hatred for Wallis was in some part the overflow of that impossibility. She could not be angry at herself for the choices she had made, because her choices had been right by her own accounting and by the accounting of the institution she had served. She could not be angry at the institution, because the institution was the thing she had organized her entire identity around. She could not fully be angry at Edward, because loving him and being angry at him in the same measure was too much to carry. She could be angry at Wallis, and she was, in the cold and organized way of a woman who did not waste energy on visible anger, but who directed the feeling precisely at the target she had decided deserved it. Wallis may or may not have deserved it in equal measure. The historical case against her is real, but not watertight. The historical case for her as a person who did not want the outcome the king chose, and who spent her life managing the consequences of it, is also real, but not without complications. The truth of her interior life, which is the thing that would settle the question, is not recoverable with the evidence available. What is recoverable is the surface, the choices people made, the positions people held, the decades they spent holding them, and the costs those decades produced. Queen Mary spent 17 years not receiving the Duchess of Windsor. The Duchess of Windsor spent those 17 years, and the rest of her life, living with the consequences of being not received. Whether either of them, in their private moments, believed the position was worth the cost, is not something the historical record can answer. Queen Mary's inner room is closed. Wallis's is equally closed. What they left in the visible world was the record of an antagonism that shaped British royal life for half a century, that influenced decisions about divorce and titles and the accommodation of personal choice within the institution for decades after the people who made the original decisions were gone, and that remains, even now, one of the clearest examples in modern history of what it costs an institution and the people inside it when the institution's requirements and the individual's desires cannot be reconciled. The crown survived. That is the fact Queen Mary most wanted to be true. It is the fact she organized everything else around. It was, in the narrow institutional sense she intended when she said it, correct. The people inside the institution, in those years and in the years that followed, paid for the survival in ways that are also part of the story, and those ways are worth remembering alongside the fact of the survival itself. Queen Mary's last years were spent in Marlborough House, the residence she had moved to after George VI's accession, and which she had proceeded to fill with the systematic completeness of a woman who regarded unoccupied shelf space as a form of negligence. She continued to be received. She continued to receive people. She attended events she considered essential and sent her regrets to the ones she did not. She was present at George VI's funeral in February 1952, aged 84, still managing her public appearance with the posture and the arranged expression of a woman who had decided decades ago that personal grief was not something you displayed in rooms where other people had to look at you. She did not attend the lying-in state entirely as planned, because her health in those months was genuinely declining, but she made herself present in the ways she could, because the funeral of a king is not an optional occasion for a queen mother, and she knew it. What she appears not to have done, in those final months between George VI's death and her own in March 1953, is reconsider anything about the abdication, about Wallis, about the position she had maintained since 1936. James Pope Hennessy, working on the biography he would eventually publish after her death, found no evidence of softening. He found a woman who was exhausted and aging, but whose inner architecture remained intact. She had made her choices. She had made them on the basis of principles she believed in and had applied consistently. She had paid for them with 17 years of estrangement from her eldest son, and with whatever private cost that estrangement had carried. She was not going to revise them at 85, with the biography being written, and the coronation approaching, and the institution she had spent her life defending finally, after everything, in the hands of a granddaughter who looked like she might actually be able to do it. Elizabeth II had been prepared for the throne with a thoroughness that reflected the lessons of the abdication. She had been taught that the crown was not negotiable, that personal desire must yield to public duty, that the institution existed before and after any individual who wore it. She had been taught this by her parents, who had lived the abdication and its consequences at very close range. She had been taught it by her grandmother, who had spent 60 years proving that it was possible to hold to those principles under considerable personal cost. Queen Mary died on March 24, 1953, at 10 past 10 in the evening, at Marlborough House. The doctors had been expecting the end for several days and had kept the household quietly prepared. The death was announced that night. The coronation was scheduled for June 2. It went ahead as planned, exactly as Queen Mary had wanted. Edward flew to London for the funeral. He came without Wallis, as he had come to his father's funeral, and as he had come to every official occasion in Britain since the abdication. He stood in the cortege. He watched his mother's coffin carried to Windsor. He was present for the burial at St. George's Chapel. Whatever passed through his mind during those days is not something the historical record captures with any precision. He wrote to people afterward and expressed his grief. He said he was glad he had been able to come. He did not bring Wallis, which meant that his mother's funeral was attended by the son, but not by the woman the son had chosen over everything else. The woman was in France. The line held past the coffin lid. After Queen Mary's death, the question of whether the royal family would extend any formal recognition to Wallis was raised again, with careful hope, by Edward, and with somewhat less hope by those who knew the family's position. The answer, as the 1950s progressed, remained no. Elizabeth II, who had the option to revisit the HRH question and did not do so, maintained the position her grandmother and parents had established. Wallis's formal status did not change. She attended British events occasionally, including Edward's investiture as a Knight of the Garter at Windsor in 1953, where the question of where she sat and how people addressed her was managed with the elaborate carefulness of a protocol office that had been navigating this question for 17 years. She and Edward maintained their Paris life. They attended dinners and travelled and gave interviews and were photographed at their French home, which Wallis had organised with the meticulous care she brought to every domestic project. The house was admired. The gardens were admired. Her style was admired by many of the same people who would not have admitted to admiring anything about her position. She had, over the years, become something that she had never quite intended to become, a fashion icon, and then a style reference, and eventually, in the decades after the abdication, a kind of cultural shorthand for the woman who caused the greatest love story, or the greatest disaster, depending on which newspaper you had read. Neither description quite fit her. Both descriptions were easier than the truth, which was a woman who had navigated a difficult life with extraordinary discipline and had ended up in a place she had not entirely planned to reach. Edward died on May 28, 1972, at Villa Windsor in Paris. He had been ill with throat cancer for months. In May, Queen Elizabeth II, Prince Philip, and Prince Charles had come to see him, his royal family arriving at his house for the first time since the abdication. He had insisted on dressing properly for the visit. He was sitting in a chair when they arrived. He was, by all accounts, very ill, but determined to receive his niece the Queen with the decorum that the occasion required. The nurse Julie Alexander later said that one of the things on Edward's mind during his last weeks was Wallis's formal status, the HRH title that had never been granted. He reportedly raised it with the Queen during the Paris visit. The Queen reportedly said nothing that constituted a commitment. He died without the request being granted. Wallis organised the funeral. She accompanied his body back to Britain. She attended the service at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, where Edward was laid in state. She was received by Elizabeth II and the Duke of Edinburgh. She stayed at Buckingham Palace. She was shown the private apartments. She was treated, for those few days, with a form of courtesy that acknowledged that she was the widow of the Queen's uncle and that the time had come to behave accordingly. She did not receive the HRH title. But she was received. It was not the recognition Edward had spent 35 years pressing for. It was not the acknowledgement that Wallis had been a suitable person for royal recognition. It was a courtesy extended to a widow, temporary and situation-specific, and not intended to set a precedent for anything going forward. After Edward's burial at Frogmore, Wallis returned to France. She was 75 years old. Her health had already been declining before Edward's death, and the strain of the final illness and the funeral had worsened it. She became increasingly withdrawn. She saw fewer and fewer visitors. Her household managed her care with the professionalism of people who understood that the woman they were looking after was the Duchess of Windsor, and that even in ill health, she required a certain standard of presentation. She had a series of falls. She had surgery. She became, in the later 1970s and into the 1980s, largely confined to her house. People who visited her in those years described a woman who was sometimes present and sometimes entirely absent, who sometimes recognized them and sometimes did not, who sometimes made the dry, precise remarks that had always been her signature and sometimes sat in silence. She died on April 24, 1986. She was 89. She was buried at Frogmore beside Edward, in the ground that had been his family's. In a way, it had never quite been hers, but where she would remain nonetheless. The Queen Mother, who had never received her, did not attend the funeral. The sustained Cold War that Queen Mary and the Queen Mother conducted against the Duchess of Windsor for 5 decades accomplished some things and failed to accomplish others. What it accomplished: the monarchy maintained its stated position on the sanctity of marriage and the unsuitability of divorced people in positions of royal authority for a considerable period after the abdication. The Church of England's restrictions on the remarriage of divorced people remained in place, at least nominally, through decades that tested them in various ways. The sense that the Crown held itself to standards that applied to its members with more force than they applied to anyone else was, in public perception, maintained. The institutional lesson the abdication was supposed to teach, that the throne cannot be surrendered for personal reasons without permanent consequence, was reinforced by the long management of those permanent consequences. No subsequent member of the royal family in that generation or the next publicly chose personal desire over institutional duty in a way that directly threatened the crown's operation. The lesson appears to have been absorbed, at the cost of considerable family pain and across significant time. What it did not accomplish, it did not undo the abdication. It did not restore the trust between Edward and his family that had existed before 1936. It did not make Edward regret his choice, or at least, not in any way that he acknowledged. It did not make Wallis into a warning that future generations particularly heeded, as subsequent royal history has made abundantly clear. Whether the cost was proportionate to the benefit is a question that depends on how you value institutional continuity against human cost, which is the fundamental question the abdication crisis has always asked, and which different generations answer differently. Queen Mary valued institutional continuity above most things because she had organized her entire life around the conviction that it was the most important thing to protect. She was not a person for whom that calculation needed to be made fresh each time. She had made it once, at the beginning, and had spent the subsequent decades living by it. The cost to herself was not something she discussed or invited others to assess. She bore it the way she bore everything, in private, with the curtains drawn, and the furniture arranged exactly as she wanted it. She had spent 60 years building a particular version of the monarchy, and she had watched her son dismantle part of it in a year. She did not accept the dismantling. She spent 17 years making clear that she did not accept it. Then she died. The crown continued, which is the thing she had cared about most. Queen Mary's hatred for the Duchess of Windsor was real, and it was durable, and it was built on something that requires more than a simple emotional explanation to fully account for. It was built on 60 years of a woman's belief that certain things were required of people who occupied certain positions, a belief that had cost her personally and repeatedly, and a belief that she found insulted and negated by the events of December 1936. It was built on grief for a son she could not reach, and on anger at the woman her mind associated with his unreachability. It was built on fear for the institution she had given her life to, and on the determination that if the institution had been wounded, it would at least be shown that the wound had not been accepted without consequence. It was built, too, on something that is more uncomfortable to acknowledge, the possibility that Queen Mary saw in Wallis Simpson a woman who had used exactly the strategies that Queen Mary herself had once used. The careful management of social position, the practical attention to who stood where, the discipline of ambition, in a world organized against your ambitions, and had used them to ends that Queen Mary found unforgivable, precisely because she recognized the competence behind them. Two women from borrowed rooms. Two women who had learned early that rank and security were different things. Two women who had organized themselves, with considerable skill, around the proximity of power they had been born near but not into. One of them had spent 60 years putting the institution before herself. One of them had put herself first, or had put the man she was attached to first, which amounts to the same thing when the man in question is the King of England. Queen Mary could not forgive that. She could not forgive it because forgiving it would have meant forgiving herself for the 60 years she had chosen differently. That is the hatred in its full form. Cold, durable, personal, institutional, and ultimately impossible to separate from the story of a woman who had spent her entire life maintaining something she believed in so deeply that she could not imagine believing it less. She held that belief for 17 years past the abdication. She held it past the war, past her younger son's death, past the new queen's accession. She held it past the biography and past the failing health, and past everything the last years of a long life require you to surrender. She let go of the rest. She did not let go of that. Thank you for watching until the end of this story. If you found it as extraordinary as we did, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and leave a comment below with your thoughts on Queen Mary and the Duchess of Windsor. We read everything, and the discussion in the comments is always one of the best parts of making these videos. New stories are uploaded regularly, and we would love to have you here for the next one.